We might be a small island, but we've got a big history that's still full of mysteries. So every year, hundreds of archaeologists go out hunting for clues to our forgotten past.
I have never seen anything like that.
In 2016, their discoveries have been more exciting than ever.
It's all happening now.
You little devil, Johan!
Yeah.
In this episode, Digging for Britain showcases the very best of them from the West. Each excavation was filmed as it happened by the archaeologists themselves. Their dig diaries mean that we can be there for every exciting moment of discovery.
Cracking little find.
Superb.
And now the archaeologists are bringing their finds from pottery to metalwork to human remains into our lab so that we can get a closer look at them and find out what they tell us about our British ancestors. Welcome to Digging for Britain. In this episode, we're joining archaeologists in the West as they make discoveries that will transform the history of Britain. On Jersey, a 2,000-year-old hoard of hidden treasure
It's heavy.
reveals the terror of the Roman invasion.
Oh, that is stunningly beautiful.
In Tintagel, Cornwall, an incredible Dark Age palace is uncovered at the mythical home of King Arthur. See, I'm starting to go on flights of fancy now, and to me, this is where King Arthur lived. And on Salisbury Plain, a lost map unearths hidden trenches that revolutionise our view of the First World War.
This is as if the British have captured the German trenches and then they have to dig in facing German counterattack from up the hill.
To put these revelations in context, I've come to Bristol Museum. And I've been given privileged behind-the-scenes access to see some of the archaeological treasures rarely seen by the public. But our first dig diary takes us 40 miles away to Stonehenge. "3,000 years ago, our ancestors built Stonehenge as a site of ceremony and ritual west of the River Avon. In recent years, archaeologists have come to believe that Stonehenge is just part of a vast sacred landscape full of monuments. But so far, their discoveries have mainly been to the west of the Avon. What lies to the east has largely been a mystery, until this year, when a team from Wessex Archaeology started digging at Bulford. At Bulford, just 3 miles away from Stonehenge, the discoveries were not only unexpected, they were unique, and they're helping to write a whole new chapter in the history of this archaeologically rich landscape.
Shiv this out a bit.
Phil Harding leads the team.
Hi, this is Phil Harding. I'm talking to you on the edge of Salisbury Plain, about 3 miles east of Stonehenge. That's in that direction there. And I'm working on a site here. We've been working here since, just before Christmas now. And this is really quite an exciting site. Come and have a look.
The team has uncovered something never seen in Britain before. A double henge. 2 circular banks and ditches.
So what we found are 2 previously unknown henge monuments. This is an incredible opportunity to unravel part of the ritual landscape of this part of Wiltshire, most importantly, just down the road from Stonehenge.
So what Phil really wants to find out is whether this site was in use at the same time as Stonehenge, and exactly what our Neolithic ancestors were doing here. Ground-penetrating radar reveals a series of pits just outside the double henge.
That is amazing.
Phil hopes that these will provide the evidence he needs.
An axe. Excellent.
It's a promising find.
That is absolutely gorgeous. With a blade there, just beautifully polished.
Neolithic axes were incredibly important tools used for the clearing of trees during the earliest days of farming. Putting one in a pit seems like a huge sacrifice.
There would be plenty of use left in this, and to place one of these in a pit, throw away a genuinely useful axe. Why would you do it?
As well as dozens of axe heads, mysterious chalk balls are found in the pits.
Lovely. Oh, what a gem.
These are finds that connect us to our ancestors, and for Phil, it's precious evidence of what they were doing here.
I'm sure they must have been maybe lucky mementos, maybe superstitious, maybe totemic items, some sort of votive offering to the gods, and maybe it brought them good luck.
In 1 week, 40 pits are excavated, and what's found in each one is remarkably similar.
This is an incredible collection of material. It's as though people have got a checklist and they're placing objects into the pit.
These are such enigmatic clues, glimpses of the rituals being carried out at the double henge.
Didn't want to come.
But some of the pits contain something rather different.
Now, that is what I call a bone.
It's from an aurochs,
God, look at the size of it.
a giant prehistoric cow.
The aurochs was not on the average Friday night takeaway menu. I think what we are really looking at is festive, feasting, celebrations. Who knows, it might be seasonal, it might be marriage, it could be any other things. But what it is not is your day-to-day rubbish.
This seems then to be a ritual site where our ancestors held religious feasts. But can Phil be sure that it's contemporary with Stonehenge?
Can we prove that these ring ditches is of the same date as our Neolithic pits? If we can do that, then we actually find an incredible ritual complex of the same date as maybe Stonehenge.
The team digs a trench across the double henge, looking for evidence that will give them a date.
Phil, look at that.
What you got there then? Pot?
Yeah, that's a decoration.
Ah! That is?
Yeah.
I swear that is. That's decorated. You little devil, Johan.
It's a fragment of pottery.
Well, I'm getting really, really excited about this because it looks like it is decorated. You can see there's a bit of a ridge there and a bit of a ridge there, and these grooves. And I think that that is the best indicator that we've got of grooved ware, which is the typical late Neolithic pottery. That is what we want to find.
Grooved ware pottery like this dates from the same period as Stonehenge, so it strongly suggests that this double henge was in use at the same time. I've invited Phil to come into our lab with some of his finds to give me a fuller picture as to what our ancestors were really up to at this unique site.
They are places where people are gathering together and feasting, and they have to be ceremonial monuments.
So these very strange balls, I mean, what are those about?
These are made out of chalk. What you'll notice in some places, you look at that, you can see the actual manufacturing traces. Now, chalk is a very soft rock. If you start beating it about too much, you will wear those manufacturing traces away. So I think that they are ritual material, being made for some function, and then they are then being placed in the pit. Those spheres, those balls are special.
Now, what about the stone tools then? So these were coming out of the pits as well.
Axes. Axes were incredibly powerful objects to them. They're almost symbolic offerings to show their wealth, their status, their power, because the material that is in the pits is the refuse, if you like, from people who are carrying out the ceremonies in our henge-type monuments.
This completely unexpected discovery reveals a significant ritual site where Neolithic people gathered for ceremonies and feasting. By the time you've done all your post-excavation work on this, what are you going to add to our understanding of the Stonehenge landscape?
The people at my site would probably have witnessed the construction of Stonehenge.
They're just a few miles away.
And what we've now done is we're moving our knowledge from the west bank of the River Avon and showing that equally as important is life on the east bank. And it just blows me over. I mean, I'm just absolutely...
Britain's first double henge is a massive discovery that over the next few years could fundamentally change our understanding of how our ancestors 4,500 years ago used the Stonehenge landscape.
Discover the past with exclusive ancient history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians from History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to explore everything from the wonders of Pompeii to the rebellion of Boudica and the mysteries of prehistoric Scotland. Immerse yourself in the captivating stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
Our next excavation also takes place on Salisbury Plain, just 5 miles away from Stonehenge. But the story it's revealing is very different and took place just 100 years ago. 2016 was the 100th anniversary of the Battle of the Somme, the bloodiest battle in the history of the British Army, with 60,000 casualties on the first day alone. Those that led the campaign have been widely criticised for the way the battle was fought, for the inexperience and inadequate training of the soldiers. But does archaeology support that perception that the young men of Britain were sent to the Western Front like lambs to the slaughter? Salisbury Plain. Covering an area the size of the Isle of Wight, for over 100 years it's been the site of Britain's largest military training ground. During World War I, thousands of soldiers came here in preparation for fighting in the trenches of northern France. However, it's often thought that this training was too short and inadequate. Incredibly, a map has been uncovered in the National Archive that might change this perception once and for all. It suggests that the army was at least planning to recreate German trenches of the Western Front in these fields, so our soldiers could rehearse attacks on them. But were those trenches ever actually dug and used for training? Military archaeologist Richard Osgood has come to investigate.
To get a map of where they've sited these practice trenches is really unusual. You've got individual notifications on the map. So an S is a shelter. MG, you might have guessed, is a machine gun position. To get all that together is really a huge opportunity. But nonetheless, the map tells you about what they're meant to do. It doesn't tell you what actually does happen. Maybe this map was schematic, maybe it's not what's dug. Our job here over the next couple of weeks is really to see what's left under the ground, and the ideal would be to get architecture from trenches and evidence for the lives of the people that were here 100 years ago.
trench warfare dominated World War I, with the invention of new powerful weapons such as massed artillery bombardments and rapid-firing machine guns, soldiers were forced to dig trenches to hide in for protection. Soldiers could live in these trenches for weeks at a time before being ordered to go over the top and charge at the enemy. If Richard can prove that extensive German trench fortifications were recreated on Salisbury Plain, it's proof that the soldiers sent here received comprehensive training in attacking German positions, dispelling the notion that they were ill-prepared. On the first day of the dig, Richard's team starts to look for evidence of one of the German frontline trenches marked on the map.
We're looking for a machine gun position. It's marked, helpfully, MG on the map. Already we're finding lots and lots of traces of the architecture of the trench, and this is just stripping the topsoil off.
Richard finds a post from which barbed wire would have been hung, cleverly designed so it could be put into the ground without making a noise.
If you're putting a barbed wire fence into no man's land, you're hitting it with a hammer, it's making a big noise, and snipers soon are attracted to that. The way they work out how to deal with that is to put these things in, and this will have a sort of a corkscrew at the bottom, and to put it into the ground you put a stick through this eyelet and then you wind it down into the ground.
And a few metres away they find the barbed wire that it would have supported.
You know, you look at the obstacle of that. Imagine having that in front of the feature you're trying to take. It's a real impediment.
Then, just behind where the barbed wire was found, they discover what they've been looking for: a section of a frontline German trench.
So we're on the German frontline trenches, and we were hoping to find the firing positions. Do you think we've got any evidence for that, Rich?
We've got some really good evidence. We've got what we've identified now as a fire step. So a fire step is what lets you stand up out of the trench. So when you need to fire, you can get up, you can fire over the top, and then when you finish, you can get down into the relative safety of that extra 1.5 foot worth of soil.
This is clear evidence that the soldiers were training to capture authentically recreated frontline German trenches. But were the fortifications marked on the map behind the front line also built? If they were, it would prove that the soldiers were training not only to attack the front line, but also to fight right through to the rear.
Okay, so we've got this really interesting shelter, and importantly we've got the corrugated iron roof that covered the shelter. We've got this little step here, which is probably some sort of seating arrangement so that with the roof above people could sit underneath.
Shelters like these would have offered some protection from the elements, as well as from the shrapnel of artillery bombardments.
Even more interesting is at the very bottom we've got all this trample, which actually shows where the troops would have been walking during the time of using these trenches.
The trample floor isn't the only evidence that these trenches weren't just for show, but were used by large numbers of soldiers.
What we're looking at, is it a latrine or not?
It is a latrine. For you, it's more of a urinal rather than a proper toilet. We know that because of the yellow sandy-like material at the bottom.
That's put very politely.
Richard is now excavating trenches even further back from the front line, and here he finds evidence of how soldiers were trained to continue the battle once the German trenches had been captured.
There's a shelf facing up the hill in each of these little slots. This is as if the British have captured the German trenches and they've worked their way through the German front line, they've got through the reserve and support lines, and then they have to dig in facing the presumed German counterattack from up the hill.
It's evidence that major battle simulations were taking place here. After 2 weeks, they've uncovered an extensive network of trenches, shelters and machine gun positions, a faithful recreation of what soldiers could expect to encounter on battlefields like the Somme.
They utilised the high ground over there, they utilised the high ground in front of me, and the hillside behind me. And this is just the German positions. This is hectares and hectares. It's a vast training landscape.
It's incredible that this map had been lost, and without it we wouldn't have had a clue that so much effort had been made in recreating such an amazingly huge trench system. Richard's discovery on the ground changes World War I history and the view that soldiers were poorly trained before being sent to war.
People that are training through this in 1915 are getting as good an experience as they possibly can. This is the example of generals really trying their very best to give the training required for what's going to happen in 1916, getting away from the idea of these chaps just walking around the parade square with broom handles and then being sent to imminent death on the Battle of the Somme.
Even practising on Salisbury Plain, trench warfare must have been miserable. So what can archaeology tell us about the men who trained here? Richard has come into the lab to tell me. And you've got some of the artefacts here as well.
Yeah, we do. This is all about morale in many ways. You can be bored in the trenches and wet and miserable, and the one thing you want to do if you're sitting there cold and tired is to have a brew. And that tin over there, that's a tin of condensed milk.
Right.
And the soldiers bayoneted it.
Yeah.
You can imagine them sitting there in the trench, need a brew, and you pour that, the condensed milk in, chuck the tin away. And that's, I think that's lovely. That's all about keeping sane, frankly. The other thing you've got connected with that sort of thing is that thing. I'm really pleased this was empty and we didn't damage it in opening it, because that's a tin of sardines. You can imagine what that would have been like 100 years on if we'd opened it.
Yeah.
But again, having things like tins of fish, cups of tea, will make these practice trenches not seem quite so bad as they might otherwise. They're not under fire from the Germans here, but nonetheless, they've got the same sort of misery of existence, and that's the sort of thing that's critical to get into the training.
And what's this? This has got some writing on it.
You can see Liverpool reg on it. It's part of the King's Liverpool Regiment. You think of the famous Kitchener poster in 1914, the big recruitment one. It's these guys, recruited in 1914, but we had no idea that they were pretty certainly here, training for what became the Battle of the Somme, and they've left that carving behind.
So they've just carved that in a lump of chalk.
Bored soldier carving their regiment into this thing, and it ends up in the bottom of the trench.
But a fantastic record they were there.
Oh, it's lovely. And we didn't know they were there. That's why archaeology is brilliant, because that links you to the people, and that's what's so crucial, that you get back to those individual stories of those guys that were here in the First War. After that training experience, they then go through into this very famous first day of the Battle of the Somme, and for them, it goes pretty well. They take relatively... Yeah,
because there are thousands and thousands
famous
of
figure
casualties.
of 60,000 casualties on the first day. But for the Liverpool pals, they fight alongside the French on the right-hand side of the British attack, and they take all their objectives and they take relatively few casualties. And that's not the story you get when you think of the Battle of the Somme.
Despite the extensive training that Richard has shown these soldiers received, training wasn't enough. Just a few weeks after their success on the first day of the Somme, the 4,000 eager young volunteers of the Liverpool Pals had received over 1,000 casualties. A shocking 1 in 4. This is one of Bristol Museum's greatest treasures, the Thornbury Hoard. It consists of 11,460 coins, and it was buried in the 4th century AD, just as the Roman army was withdrawing from Britain. But actually, this pales into insignificance beside a recently discovered hoard, one of the largest ever found, this time dating to the 1st century BC, when Britain was on the cusp of being assimilated into the Roman Empire. The island of Jersey. In 2012, 2 metal detectorists found a massive hoard of 2,000-year-old coins in a potato field. Jersey heritage painstakingly excavated. It was the world's biggest discovery of Iron Age coins ever. The archaeologists wanted to find out what treasures lay inside, and what it tells us about the British Isles at a time when the Romans were advancing towards our shores. The hoard was taken to the local museum where conservator Neil Mara and his team began the painstaking task of clearing off the mud. There were an extraordinary 70,000 coins. And more treasure lay hidden within. Unusual coloured beads.
Rather lovely.
And gold and silver bracelets.
This has been much more complicated than expected. We're lifting one piece at a time out, but everything is interlinked and fitted around each other. Haha, success. It's a piece of silver wire, probably from jewellery, just cut up and essentially just scrap metal now.
Who would have cut up this precious metal, and why was it all hidden? As they dig deeper into the hoard looking for clues, they uncover its greatest treasure.
It's heavy. It's heavy.
An amazing collection of thick golden torques, ornate neck rings. Only the most important people in Iron Age society would have worn neck rings of this thickness and weight. After 2,000 years in the ground, it's taken Neil 4 years carefully picking it apart to reveal its contents.
We've now removed 50,000 coins, so we're, we think, 5/7 of the way in. About 20,000 coins left, and you can see there are still a few things outstanding.
With so much of the hoard now revealed, Neil has made some startling revelations.
Well, it's the biggest coin hoard of its kind in the world. We know which tribe actually made it because the coins that have already come off and we've cleaned are of a type we've seen before from the Salysbury tribe, with a head on one side and a very, very abstract horse on the other.
The Salysbury were an Iron Age tribe of Celts that inhabited part of what is now Brittany in France. So why did they bury this vast treasure on Jersey? Neil has come into the lab with some of this amazing treasure to tell me. Neil, let's be clear about this. This is an absolutely enormous hoard, isn't it?
It is. I mean, it's got the stage now where in this hoard we've got more coins of this period than have been found in France at all.
In the whole of France?
Yeah, and as we've gone through it, we found more and more apart from the coins. Torques were the big surprise for us. I mean, this is one of 8 complete ones that we have.
Can I pick that up?
Yeah, please do.
So this is a gold Iron Age neck ring.
Yeah.
How do you get it onto your neck?
They come in 2 halves, so you'd literally give it like a twist like that and then pull apart.
And the pattern is peculiar because it's not facing the observer,
No,
it's kind of facing the wearer.
It would be inside by your throat, yes.
Yeah, that's beautiful. What about the coins themselves? Do they give us a clue as to the date?
I mean, literally 99.5% of the coins in this hoard dates are around sort of 62 BC or before.
They're
dated.
lovely. Look at that.
They're beautiful faces,
wonderful
aren't they?
little face on that side.
We know that those were all made in the run-up to the invasion by Julius Caesar, and so perhaps they knew that Julius Caesar was coming up from the south, defeating, you know, tribe after tribe after tribe, and that they hid their wealth. They actually got it offshore, rowed the thing to Jersey. That we seem to be somewhere that was quite hard to reach, quite hard to land, and so perhaps it was somewhere to hide. And dug it, buried it, with the idea, presumably, of coming back for it later, and were perhaps killed.
The burial of the Jersey hoard reveals the fear that gripped the Celtic tribes as the Romans advanced towards our shores. But conversely, the Thornbury hoard at Bristol Museum dates from a time when, 300 years later, the Romans were in retreat, showing us that the collapse of empire could be equally tumultuous. The Thornbury hoard that's on display upstairs is just a small portion of the 11,460 Roman coins that were discovered. And so I've come down here to the stores to look more closely at some of those coins and find out more about the hoard. How was it discovered?
It was discovered by a man who was digging a fish pond in his back garden. So he found the remains of a pot with over 11,500 coins inside, all of a similar type, all of a similar period.
These coins act as a history of the Roman Empire.
Virtually all the coins are Constantinian, so Constantine, the emperor that's associated with enabling Christianity to be worshipped across the empire.
And found in Constantinople.
And found in Constantinople. So you get two types of coins. So you get one coin in this hoard which hark back to the foundation of Rome.
Ah, that's beautiful. So we've got a little wolf with Romulus and Remus underneath. That's a gorgeous coin. Look at that.
And then there's a female personification of the new empire's capital, which is Constantinople, and that is Constantinopolis.
The coins are also evidence of the empire's decline.
By this time, the coinage has become very debased. There's very little silver content, and virtually everything is made out of copper alloy, and also not quite as well modelled.
So the coins are being literally debased. They are getting smaller. Is this a sign of a crumbling economy then as Rome goes into decline?
Yes, the debasing everything.
So where were these minted then? Are they British coins in origin?
None of the ones that I've seen are actually from Britain. We know that because they have little marks on the bottoms of them. We've done a sort of, it's almost like an airline map of where these things have come from, and the furthest one that we've found is Antioch in Turkey, and we've got things from Thessalonica, but also Croatia.
As part of the empire, Roman Britain was connected with diverse people and cultures across Europe and beyond, and this was also a period of relative peace. But when the empire crumbled, it must have been a difficult and even frightening experience for many people. And why on earth was this volume of coins buried?
That's the $64,000 question, because we have no idea.
This was a troubled time, wasn't it? So, I mean, I suppose there are numerous different reasons that somebody could be burying money in the ground.
They could.
They could be trying to hide it. It could be effectively banking it.
And you kept it and you hid it from anybody. You didn't want to have it. And that might be somebody you thought was coming to raid. And clearly we have no idea why nobody collected it.
By the 4th century AD, the Romans were pulling out of Britain, and whoever buried these coins never came back for them. Britain was plunged into a period of uncertainty for the next 600 years, sometimes known as the Dark Ages. Our next excavation provides brand new and very strange clues as to how our ancestors made sense of this upheaval. For archaeologists, burial sites can offer precious clues as to how our ancestors lived and died, but sometimes they also provide us with surprising insights into what seem to us today to be bizarre beliefs and strange rituals long since forgotten. Deep in the Wye Valley in Hereford, a team of archaeologists is on their way to investigate an intriguing discovery near a remote cave.
Day one, the site is up a very, very steep slope, which is densely wooded. On 3 sides of the site, there are 60-foot high vertical cliffs. And immediately above the site, there is the opening of a small cave.
Known locally as Merlin's Cave, in the 1920s an incredible find of prehistoric tools, pottery and bones was made, revealing this to be a sacred burial site for our Neolithic ancestors over 4,500 years ago. But in 2011 a new discovery was made, purely by chance, just below the entrance.
I was doing caving with one of my sons, and we decided to try and get into this cave, which is about 15 foot up the cliff face. So I left my son sat on what was a tree throw. While I was scaling the cliff here, he discovered a flint scraper, a really lovely flint scraper, and some pieces of pottery and some teeth.
Clyde took the finds to the county archaeologist.
The pottery was prehistoric, the teeth were human, and the flint was early Neolithic.
The county archaeologist Tim Hovard was so intrigued by the finds that he organised a dig to see if he could find whether there was a connection between these new finds and the ones in the cave. What he found was even more exciting.
We found 2 human skeletons laid out under 2 of the tree throws. We carbon dated them to about 600 AD.
This was shocking. Tim had expected to find Neolithic skeletons, but these were Dark Age skeletons from the 7th century AD, and they were lying outside a prehistoric burial site. But with such a huge time difference, surely there couldn't be a connection. Then the next piece of evidence emerged.
One of the burials had bones deposited with it, dated to the Bronze Age from the cave, so 12, 13, 1400 years older than the burial.
The prehistoric human bones seem to have been deliberately placed in the later graves. Whoever buried these men clearly knew about the earlier burials inside the cave.
So what we wanted to know was who these people were and why they were involved with the burial in the cave. We know that they were doing something very strange, very different.
Are these 2 men the only ones buried here, or are they part of something much bigger? This year, another dig was organised to find out.
It's a very unusual place to find people being buried. We're on a very steep hillside. The soil isn't very deep. It's actually quite hard to make a grave that's deep enough to bury a body. Now, the reason we've come back here to do further investigations is to try and determine the extent of this burial activity. Do we only have 2 burials, or is it actually a small cemetery?
A trench is dug a short distance from where the 2 burials were found. After 2 days of digging, they start to get results.
We've just found a human bone which is projecting out of the side of the section of the trench. It's a fragment of a large human femur, and we're further to the south of where the previous 2 burials are, and it's giving us an idea that the extent of this burial area is considerably larger than we'd seen previously.
More human remains are uncovered.
We've just found this, which is a human tooth. It's actually a human canine, an adult tooth.
And then a little bit of bone, which is just from the path.
Now we're finding remains of other skeletons, including the thigh bone of a newborn child. Now, up to now, all of the bones found from these burials have been of adults, but now we're finding evidence that even very young infants are being buried at this site.
Analysis shows that these date from the same period as the skeletons first found beneath the cave entrance. It's evidence that the team has uncovered the burial ground of a Dark Age community. It's an incredibly strange discovery. Prehistoric burials inside the cave seem to have been so important to this community 2,000 years later that they chose to be buried close to the cave, even though digging graves on this steep ground must have been incredibly difficult. And another discovery is made, evidence that these people are also being buried, along with bones from inside the cave.
Now, on the top of this bone here, we can see encrustation, and this is in fact tufa or stalagmite, which is only formed inside the caves. This bone has come out of a cave. So this provides a direct link between the cave up there and what's being deposited down here.
The team from Manchester University have discovered not only a forgotten burial ground, but a strange funerary ritual that's been lost for 1400 years. I'm interested to find out what the archaeologists think was going on here. So you've got Dark Age burials outside the cave, and then inside the cave there seems to have been a lot of bone, human and animal bone, from much, much earlier. Some period in prehistory.
From at least the Neolithic. It's buried with two cow bones.
So this bit here?
Yep.
So a bit of cow rib.
And then there's the knuckle of a cow leg bone by his head that he was buried with as well.
Tim believes there could be a special connection between this particular man and the earlier burials inside the cave. And have you analysed the bones? What are you able to say about this individual?
He is certainly well into his 50s, if not in his early 60s when he died. He was a very tall person, or at least he was well over 6 feet.
We can see that with him lying out here, can't we? I mean, look at those thigh bones.
Yeah. The fact that he is large and robust and lived to a reasonable age would suggest that, if nothing else, he was well fed, which may suggest that he was being looked after.
So who do you think he was?
I think, just with the fact that he's buried with animal bones that must have come from the cave, that he was actually in charge of looking after the contents of the cave for a period of time.
So you're seeing this as a sort of cult centre then?
I think a cult is probably the way to look at it. They're honouring their ancestors, and they're honouring a cave that, as far as they're concerned, has been there for millennia. But at the same time, both burials seem to be laid out in, broadly speaking, a Christian tradition. Extended with arms folded over the pelvis.
So in that sense they're following the Christian tradition, but there is this little bit of prehistoric bone as perhaps an indication that, okay, we're going to do this Christian style, but we'll include something from the past to show that we haven't forgotten about that tradition.
The Dark Ages were a tumultuous period in British history. Anglo-Saxon tribes were invading, and it was a time of great political and religious change, with the establishment of new kingdoms and pagan ideas vying with Christianity for supremacy.
It's highly likely that these weren't Anglo-Saxons. These were actually the native Welsh Britons, if you like, and they're adapting to Christianity as it comes from the south and east and moving up into the west, and they're gradually adapting.
Strange sight, and I think it really reminds us we don't expect everybody across England and Wales to be doing exactly the same thing at the same time. The community at Merlin's Cave reached back into their past, combining burial practice with what seems to be an ancestor cult, and perhaps that provided them with much needed reassurance during such an uncertain period in our history. After the Romans left, Dark Age Britain is often thought of as less civilised and more backward. A time when we lost cultural and trading connections, not only with Rome, but with the world at large. But now a striking new discovery in Tintagel, Cornwall, is challenging this view. Tintagel is best known for its connections with the legendary King Arthur, who, according to myth, was conceived there. Well, this year, archaeologists returned to Tintagel, hoping to investigate its rich Dark Age history and disentangle archaeological fact from Arthurian fiction. The castle remains that you can see on Tintagel today date from the medieval period, but archaeological remains from around 600 AD, found on previous excavations, suggest that there was once a large Dark Age settlement here. In 2016, archaeologists returned to Tintagel to explore areas of the island that had never been dug before. They wanted to find out what kind of settlement it was, but what they found took them all by surprise.
Day one of the Dig Diary, and today we've started excavating on the eastern terrace just here and over behind the castle on the southern terrace. We've opened up 4 trenches, and that's where we're hoping to find what we used to call Dark Age buildings, or buildings that belong to the 5th and 6th century.
The archaeologists from English Heritage and Cornwall Archaeological Unit have barely begun to strip off the turf when they make their first discovery.
We've got this possible floor layer of paving.
Evidence for the construction of terraces.
What it looks like is that we have 3 distinct flat terraces with slopes between at the moment, which we hope when we take some material away we'll find some nice walls.
Disappointingly, further digging reveals no traces of buildings.
Maybe there are some terraces which are being used for small enclosures, maybe as cultivation plots rather than for buildings.
But who were these cultivation plots for? On the south side of the island, they make an extraordinary discovery.
We have 3 terraces, this being the substantial wall at the southern end and leading to another wall, presumably for a building, and that leads nicely to a set of steps, and they lead neatly through part of the top building. So we think this is the building, nice level floor and steps up to it.
This is their first big breakthrough. Massive 1 metre thick rock walls are revealed. Never before has such a solid Dark Age building been discovered in Britain.
Substantial build to top and top end.
But what is this building? In their search for clues, they find a rubbish pit next to it.
We've got an animal jawbone here, so you can see the teeth. Something like a wild boar, perhaps.
The remains of boar and other animals may be evidence of a Dark Age feast.
I can see.
And further surprising finds suggest this was a high-status building.
So shallow bowl, nice rim. Put a bit of fruit in or something.
Oh, it's beautiful. It looks like Viking, which is from Turkey. So that is a beautiful thing.
And Carl Thorpe, the small finds expert, is particularly excited by the discovery of an incredibly rare piece of glass.
Thought you like it.
Oh, that is stunningly beautiful.
Yeah.
That is definitely post-Roman glass. It's even a rim, which is fantastic. And judging from the curvature, I think it is of a little cone cup between the 5th and sort of 7th centuries AD. Sort of Merovingian glass, originating in France.
Somewhere, yeah. For what? For
most likely drinking wine. And that is just, it's always stunningly beautiful.
The team was simply not expecting to find this many high-quality foreign goods. The people living here were clearly not only very wealthy, but trading over vast distances.
Got a small sherd of what looks to be amphora. That's from the Aegean area, Eastern Mediterranean.
Wow.
So,
fantastic.
Yeah.
By day 12, the team has unearthed the foundations of a building 11 metres long and 4 metres wide. They're convinced that the people who lived here must have had immense wealth and power.
I don't think that anything like this has been found before. So there was some surprised faces, and lo and behold, it's gone on and on. So this might be the style for the whole precinct of buildings on the southern side. Substantial walls will hold up substantial roofs. So, yeah, it's all good. Very exciting.
Further excavations throughout the rest of the summer revealed that this was just part of a large complex covering much of Tintagel. This has astounded the team. They didn't expect to find evidence of such a wealthy and sophisticated community from early Dark Age Britain. So do they really think they've discovered a Dark Age palace? And if so, what was it like to live in it?
We can't be certain that it's a royal site, but whatever it was a high status site because we got so much exotic material.
Yeah, so I mean, we saw some of this material coming out. So tell me about this piece of pottery.
Yes, well, this is very, very finely made. It's probably part of a
thin there.
Yes,
Gosh.
it's probably it's a fine table dish. A complete vessel would be quite large, so you've got this sort of large, expansive, quite shallow bowl, probably for communal feastings. And this is the handle of an amphora sherd, which would have contained wine coming from the Aegean, from Turkey, Marseille, around the coast of Spain. You know,
And this is not actually from Tintagel, is it?
This is a reconstruction of what one of these amphorae from the Aegean, from Greece, might have looked like. But this would be for carrying wine, probably, but could also be for olive oil. We don't know, but...
And the archaeology that you're looking at here, of course, dates to a really interesting time. We're looking at Britain after the collapse of the Roman Empire. We're looking at independent states.
Yeah, I mean, Britain does break into lots of little states, like Mercia and Wessex and Kent and places, and Cornwall carries on in its own way. And this may well be a royal centre with connections far afield.
See, I'm starting to go on flights of fancy now, and to me, this is the royal apartments of the palace at Tintagel.
Yeah.
This is where King Arthur lived.
Well, it has got that extraordinary association from when Geoffrey of Monmouth writes about the history of the kings of Britain in the 12th century. He says that Arthur was conceived at Tintagel.
Yeah.
What, did he invent this? Had he pulled it out of various other legends? We really don't know.
Although they may not have found evidence of King Arthur himself, the team have discovered that Dark Age Tintagel was a prosperous centre of trade and perhaps even a seat of royalty, a bastion against the turmoil that was engulfing Britain at this time. In the past, infant mortality rates were much, much higher than they are today. In the Dark Ages, it's thought that perhaps half of all children didn't make it to adulthood. And yet, when you look at cemeteries from the period, there just don't seem to be enough juvenile and infant burials. So were the burial rites for children different to those for adults? It's certainly possible. And archaeologists in South Wales have been making some intriguing discoveries. In the winter of 2014, record storms battered South Wales. They were so ferocious that they eroded the Pembrokeshire coastline. And human bones started to appear as the sand dunes were stripped back, revealing an ancient cemetery. These skeletons may contain precious clues about our past. So for the last 3 years, a team from Dyfed Archaeology has been trying to save what they can from this now dangerously exposed site.
This is classic rescue archaeology. Absolutely, you can see here that the threat is obvious and happening, and we're just dealing with it.
It's day 3 of this year's dig, and they are beginning to excavate the Dark Age layers from the 7th to the 9th centuries AD. One burial emerges that is incredibly unusual and entirely different to anything they've seen so far.
So it seems to be a woman buried with a baby in the crook of her arms.
That's right.
That's incredible. Yeah. That's the baby's head, yeah.
Skull there. Pelvis in this area.
Okay.
Here's the mother's left arm.
Finding an infant burial from this time is extremely rare. Tiny bones tend to decompose quickly in many cemeteries. But here, the infant bones are perfectly preserved by the coastal sand.
Ken, do you want to tell me what you're drawing?
It's a kiss grave containing the remains of what looks like an infant.
An infant's kiss grave.
A newborn, probably. Or
Yes.
even a perinatal, very small child. You can see from the length of it.
Yeah.
And incredibly, other infant burials soon begin to emerge.
It It's rare to find this quantity of infants in a communal cemetery. It doesn't matter what date it's from, they are rare to find. Here we've got a large number of them because the preservation in the sand has been so good for skeletal remains.
By week 3, they've found an incredible 20 infant graves, a sobering reminder of infant mortality rates at this time, and an intimate insight into how parents felt about losing so many young children at such an early age, 1400 years ago.
So what we've got here is a really rather nice bone pin, possibly a shroud pin. And some of the burials that we've had here, you can see from the position of the skeleton, the feet particularly, that these people look like they were wrapped in shrouds when they were buried. There was one absolutely tiny little infant. I actually excavated it myself. Its legs were actually crossed at the ankles, so again it suggests it was wrapped before being placed in the ground.
This pin would have been used to carefully secure the shroud around this dead child before it was placed in its grave. And out of the sand comes an intriguing series of finds.
This is one of a number of areas where we've had white quartz pebbles across the site, but they've been the graves of infants. So the pebbles have been really carefully placed. We had one with over 100 pebbles on the top of it, densely packed, and obviously a lot of care invested in the grave of the baby inside.
So what did these quartz pebbles signify? Dig co-director Marion Shiner and osteologist Katie Hemmer have come into the lab to tell me about their discoveries and what they tell us about the attitude of Dark Age parents to the deaths of their children.
We don't know the purpose of the quartz pebbles. They're found in mortuary contexts from the prehistoric period onward, and they're found at other early medieval Welsh cemeteries. There's a passage in the Bible in Revelation which talks about the person who has found Christ being given a white stone and in that a new name. There is evidence that in the later medieval period, each mourner at a funeral brought a stone or took a stone and put it on top of the grave, but there must have been over 130 people at the funeral of that child, if that's what this is signifying, and they are only on the children's graves.
And they're burying very, very tiny children, infants.
Yes, it's the thing that really strikes you about the site is the level of care that a lot of these infants and young children were buried with.
Absolutely, I think we have to move away from old notions that people didn't care for their children at this time. They are investing the same amount of effort, if not more, into the burials of the really youngest members of this population.
Discoveries like this show how archaeology can change the story of Britain. From revealing lost religious practices of the Dark Ages and turning on its head our view about how prepared our soldiers were when sent to fight on the Western Front, to the unique discovery on Salisbury Plain that shows the ritual landscape of Stonehenge was bigger than we'd ever imagined. Our ancestors made the country we live in today. And through archaeology, we've been able to reach back through the centuries and touch their lives. We might be a small island, but we've got a big history. Everywhere you stand, there are worlds beneath your feet. And so every year, hundreds of archaeologists across Britain go looking for more clues into our story. Who lived here, when and how.
So there's a blade here, so he's being attacked from all angles.
Archaeology is a complex jigsaw puzzle, drawing everything together from skeletons to swords, temples to treasure.
He's biting his shield.
Biting his shield, yeah.
From Orkney to Devon, we're joining this year's quest on sea, land and air. We share all of the questions and find some of the answers as we join the teams in the field, digging for Britain. Throughout its history, Britain has been divided and enriched by invaders from overseas, and none have gripped our imaginations quite as much as the Vikings. But how much of what we think we know about the Vikings is just a stereotype? Do they really live up to their savage reputation? And how much did they influence and shape British culture? This year's Archaeology is enriching and challenging our vision of the Vikings, with digs, artefacts and messages they left behind.
Wow, that is a beautiful object.
Like the fortress of a Norwegian Viking chief in Orkney.
This cup is absolutely extraordinary, isn't it?
The magnificent hoard of silver buried in a time of bloodshed. And the victims of a vicious nationwide massacre.
But you're suddenly kind of connecting with this awful moment, which is his death.
On the Isle of Harris in the Outer Hebrides, archaeologists are just starting to bring evidence of the earliest Vikings to light. A team from the University of Birmingham is digging at a site called Horgabost. The name itself has a Norse origin, a strong hint that the Vikings were here. Just over these dunes is one of this season's targets. Now, archaeologists have been digging here before and they discovered an Iron Age settlement. But there is some archaeological evidence that the Vikings were here too. A couple of burials threatened by erosion seem to have been Norse, and small Norse finds have been discovered as well. But the archaeologists are really hoping that they're going to find evidence of a settlement. And if they do that, it will be the first of its kind on Harris.
Okay then, Alice, what we have here is a very interesting Iron Age site with a bit of a mysterious end to it, which we're sort of trying to come to terms with at the moment. If you step this way...
Some very striking layers in the ground there.
Absolutely.
The team is being led by Kevin Coles, and I joined them right at the start of the digging season. The site may hold the key to the first contacts between incoming Vikings and the Gallic people already living here. Will it be a story of destruction?
What's slightly more mysterious and slightly more interesting for me is this deposit here that's sealing everything else.
What is that? I mean, it's a completely different colour as well.
Completely different colour. It's almost a demolition debris full of very late Iron Age pottery.
Right.
And lots of charcoal, lots of sort of waste material.
Sometimes archaeology works this way. They're finding subtle glimpses within the soil of a time of abandonment.
The important thing is we need to find out when this occurred, and that's why we're taking samples for carbon dating and hopefully see if it can be because of the Norse invasion, or when the Vikings came to the islands, and whether it sort of clashes with this site being abandoned.
Close by, a building is emerging that seems to be rectangular in shape, a style that is Scandinavian and unlike the roundhouses favoured by Iron Age people. So could this be evidence of Vikings displacing the original inhabitants?
No, there's a nice corner here.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there's lots of stones in this vicinity, which suggests that the feature is running under the dunes.
Oh, I can see some here. Yeah, so they carry on going backwards, possibly in this
Absolutely,
direction.
There's more here.
Yeah. Are you going to extend the trench back?
We will extend the trench back and see if we can get the full plan and see if it is a rectangular house, which would be in line with a Norse longhouse.
But so far, perhaps the strongest evidence of the meeting of these cultures comes from a scattering of objects found across the site.
So we have, the things on this side are late Iron Age in date. So you've got a storage jar or a big cooking pot there made from ceramic. We've also got this very strange, looks like a rock. If you feel the coarseness of the outside edge when compared to the flat edge, it's been used and used constantly.
Yeah, so what's that being used for?
We suspect it's used for working animal hides.
And that fits so nicely in your hand, doesn't it?
It's very tactile, yeah.
So these finds are intriguing because they could be later Iron Age, they could be Norse.
Absolutely.
You can't really distinguish between them.
No, you can't.
But from their early investigations comes the first conclusive proof of contact with the Vikings. A tiny scrap of steatite, or soapstone, a material often imported from Scandinavia and found in great quantities on Norse sites right across Britain.
But what you can say from this fragment of soapstone bowl is that this is typically Viking. Either somebody who was already here learned how to make such a thing from a Viking, or they got it from a Viking, or it belonged to a Viking.
Exactly. So the Vikings were here.
Yeah. You can see why the Vikings might have felt at home here. This is a landscape that's perfectly suited to their seafaring way of life. You can just imagine their longships coming in and then being pulled up on these flat, wide beaches, ready to start a new life in a land that's completely surrounded by sea. And the arrival of the Vikings would mark the beginning of a new phase in this island's history, and one that would leave a lasting impression.
It's a history that is still frustratingly just below the surface on Harris, but I don't have to look far to find more substantial evidence of Norse culture. Just up the road, on the adjoining Isle of Lewis, is perhaps the most famous and iconic Scandinavian treasure ever discovered in Scotland. It was found in the 1800s, but dates from the 12th century, a time when Lewis was controlled by the kings of Norway. Still shrouded in mystery, it's a compendium of 93 ivory chess and gaming pieces, known to us as the Lewis chessmen.
A selection of the chessmen has come back to Lewis some 180 years after they were first thought to have been found. They are such charismatic little figures, and I've been fascinated by them since I was a child. My grandparents had a replica chess set. Well, now they're on tour following a new piece of research looking into their origins and their story. And it's so lovely to come here to Stornoway to see them close to where they were discovered.
The new research places the chessmen firmly at the heart of the once powerful but now forgotten Kingdom of the Isles, a hybrid Norse-Gallic state controlled by the kings of Norway. The project has been led by Dr. David Caldwell from the National Museum of Scotland.
So we've got all the characters you would expect. We've got kings and queens and bishops and knights. And who's this character here?
Right, this is a warrior or warder, and nowadays he's normally represented by a tower. He's a rook, in other words, yeah. Although this particular one, as you can just see there...
He's biting his shield.
Biting his shield, yeah. This, in fact, I think is one of the key bits of evidence that these pieces were made in the Scandinavian world, because that's a reference to a cult in the Scandinavian world, the cult of the berserkers. The berserkers were warriors who got so high before going into battle that they had to bite their shields to hold themselves back.
Really?
And I don't think this chessman is really a berserker, but I think it's the carver, in a way, just showing his cultural roots, or perhaps gently poking fun at some of his contemporaries by showing that.
The finding of the chessmen is shrouded in mystery. Tradition has it they were lost by a passing merchant, but David thinks it's possible they were owned by an important person living on Lewis.
Lewis was the centre, or one of the centres, of a Scandinavian kingdom, the Kingdom of the Isles, which people have now forgotten about. But it's a very important kingdom on a European model, which was here until 1266.
This was the year in which the Vikings handed the Hebrides over to Scotland for the sum of 4,000 marks, ending 4 centuries of Norwegian sovereignty on the islands. But who made these beautiful figures? Detailed study of their faces has revealed that they fall into 5 different types, which suggests they were made by 5 different craftsmen.
I mean, this face face is beautiful.
Yeah, that's one of my favourites. The craftsman who made this was exceptionally good. And ivory is an amazingly tough material to carve. It must have taken days to do this, but just the subtlety of the expression there, just the look. And even when you move away from the face and you look at the knuckles, the detail there, you can almost sense that the hand is actually gripping that sword.
Those little hands are absolutely beautiful, and the face, the contours of the face, there's even a change in contour when we go from the cheek down to the upper lip, that crease between the nose and the mouth is shown. These figures may be stylised, but there's every reason to believe they're based on living Scandinavians. The people who carved them were paying attention to authentic details. So the clothes aren't just figments of the imagination of the carver. This is real attire that is being represented.
Yes, they clearly have a very good understanding of what they're representing. They understand the different layers of vestments that a bishop is wearing, the chasubles, the albs, and everything else. And they represent that very carefully indeed.
These craftsmen probably worked in a major centre in Norway where they could closely observe high-status Scandinavians, where they may even have had bishops or kings as their patrons. The Vikings came to the Western Isles and created a Scandinavian state to rival the kingdoms of England and Scotland, one that we've all but forgotten about. And we have potent Viking legacies in the form of amazing craftwork that reminds us of our shared Scandinavian genes. But what lured the Vikings here in the first place? Back on Harris is another site where the archaeology is reminding us that they first came here to plunder. It's a possible medieval monastery, the ultimate temptation for a seafaring pirate. History tells us that the riches of these Christian monasteries are what drew the Vikings to our shores. This site houses a ruined chapel, and there are traces dating all the way back to an Iron Age broch or tower. Professor John Hunter is overseeing the excavations here.
Anyway, if we stand here, we just look round here. This is the outer face of the broch. Huge stones.
Fantastic. Yeah.
And you can see the collapse has fallen.
Massive.
And
Massively thick wall.
The wall's 4 metres thick, roughly. If there was an early monastery here, you're directly on the great sea routes that bring Norwegian Vikings all the way down to Ireland, and they would have seen this. It would have been sweets for the taking, really would.
Just outside the boundary of the possible monastery are some graves that might be Norse, and the team has discovered the first fragments of whoever was buried here. But is it a long-dead Viking? Oh, OK, so as well as these bits of bone...
Tooth.
A tooth,
right.
Yeah.
Tell us about that then. Where's it from?
Well, it looks like a lower incisor, I think, and it's very worn, so all of the enamel on the top has been worn down. It's somebody, he's an adult and he's been wearing that tooth down for many years. Yeah. Even if these are all that remains of a Viking, does it necessarily prove that he or she lived here? Or might this be the grave of a passing seafarer whose remains were brought to shore before the ship continued on its way? It's very exciting being here with archaeologists who are trying to work out what Harris was to the Vikings. As part of the Hebrides, it's on that sea route between Shetland and Orkney in the north and Ireland, places that were all firmly part of the Viking world. But what about Harris? Was it just a stopping off point? Were the Vikings here only transiently? Or did they actually settle here and put down roots, as the place names seem to suggest? Well, they're finding what look like Norse buildings, and we have that piece of steatite as well, which suggests that the archaeologists are just on the brink of finding the first hard evidence of Viking settlement here on Harris. In England, there's one city that boasts more evidence of Viking occupation than anywhere else in Britain. York, or Jorvik. The first Viking to take the city was Ivar the Boneless, a Danish Viking leader and reputed berserker. Jorvik became the capital of his new Danish territory in 866 AD. For the next 20 years, the Danes continued with their aggressive expansion until the English king, Alfred the Great, drew up a treaty with the Viking king, Guthrum. The country was sliced in two, and the Danes were given their own territory in the north and east, the Danelaw, with York at its heart.
Even though they only ruled here for 100 years, York is very much still associated with the Vikings. And an excavation in the 70s here at Coppergate dragged York's Viking past into the present in a very vivid way. Now all of that archaeology is sealed beneath these shops and cafes, but there's a current excavation going on in another part of the city not far from here. And again, we're starting to see the buried history of this city. So I'm going to visit the dig to find out what more we can learn about the Vikings of Jorvik.
Archaeologists have been working in an area called Hungate in the centre of the city for 4.5 years. It's a huge, multi-layered excavation, but right now the archaeologists are almost 3 metres below today's ground level and digging what I'm interested in, the Viking layer. And they're revealing that they were not just about looting and fighting. The Vikings were traders and builders of cities too. Once the Vikings had taken York, they stayed here, bringing up families and blending with the city's previous inhabitants, creating a unique culture known as Anglo-Scandinavian. And they remained even after the last Viking king had been expelled, expanding their town and putting up huge permanent buildings.
So are you into the final phase, really?
Yeah, this is the very final part.
Peter Connolly is running excavations here for the York Archaeological Trust.
It's landscape archaeology, it just happens to be in an urban environment.
Yeah.
Most of the buildings here sit on an organised grid layout, unexpected evidence that the Vikings had a talent for urban planning. The land here slopes gently down to the river, making it an ideal loading and unloading spot. These buildings were probably storage warehouses. And right in the middle of these structures, the Vikings built something that would have been totally indispensable.
The stuff that I'm digging through at the moment is effectively human waste, it's poo. Because what I'm sat in at the moment, it's the remains of a Viking toilet or cesspit. All the bits of animal bone that we're finding in here as well, it's being used as a general rubbish pit as well, although the majority of it is human waste. You are getting other bits and pieces in here as well.
But fortunately, it's not just rubbish that's come out of the ground at Hungate.
Over the 4.5 years that the archaeologists have been working here, they've turned up thousands of artefacts from the Viking period. Most of them are pottery and bone and represent household waste. But there is a handful of intriguing small finds which provide us with additional clues as to what the Vikings were doing in this part of the city.
The finds researcher at York Archaeological Trust is Nikki Rogers.
So Nikki, this is a collection of finds that are all from that excavation at Hungate?
They are. They're really a fraction of what we've found over the 5 years that we've been excavating there. We've had over 12,000 individual artefacts.
What's this here?
Well, actually, this is a jet pendant. It's quite sweet, I think, because the whole... Well, it's a bit off-centre.
I like the shape of it. I mean, that's quite a modern-looking thing, isn't it?
But that's a very typical shape from that period, in fact.
So where would that have come from, the jet for that, do you think?
Probably from Whitby.
Right.
From the north coast.
Yeah. What about these beads? Are these amber?
No, this is all amber here.
So where would that have come from, that amber,
Well,
do you think?
that's going to have come from the Baltic area.
So the Vikings living in Hungate imported high-quality material. Their trade routes stretched hundreds of miles away across the Scandinavian world. But they also used less exotic material to turn out huge numbers of an item that's a little more surprising.
Well, these are actually skates.
Really?
Yes. They're effectively very easy to make because the bone is already, you know, that size, that shape. Very little has to be done to it to turn.
So what is the bone? This is a metapodial,
yes,
isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's probably they're usually horse or cattle metapodials.
Right. Okay.
All that's been done to this one, if you look at it, is, well, on the bottom it's been flattened and smooth, so that's a very smooth, flat surface.
And that's been deliberately done?
That has been deliberately done. Your foot would have sat on here, your heel there, your toe there. You weren't able to take your foot off the ice, so you were pulling yourself along with poles.
So they're not ice dancing, they're not pirouetting around, they're keeping their feet on the ground and they're using them rather like cross-country skis.
That's it.
These simple bone objects connect us to customs imported from the frozen Norse homelands.
The archaeology of Hungate, the buried evidence of people who lived here in Jorvik 1,000 years ago, is not about monumental remains. We're not looking at the elite of society, but we're getting an insight instead into the lives of ordinary people as they started to plan their town. And we see how they adapted their buildings to suit the land and the specific purpose they wanted them for. These people lived in York, but they kept a connection with their Scandinavian homeland through the objects that they bought, used and wore. And in a very real way, 1,000 years ago, they were laying the foundations of the York that we see today.
While in York, the Vikings and Anglo-Saxons learnt to get along, throughout the rest of England, their relationship remained uneasy. Although pockets of Danes lived and traded here, they hadn't gained a permanent foothold, and full-scale Danish raids continued along the coast. The English king Ethelred the Unready was repeatedly forced to pay them off with huge sums of money, known as Danegeld. And the growing tension between these clashing nations led to a horrific act, the St. Brice's Day massacre. But the perpetrators of this slaughter were not Vikings, they were Anglo-Saxon. And what's more, the murder was sanctioned by King Ethelred. He decreed that
all the Danes who had sprung up in this island, sprouting like cockle amongst the wheat, were to be destroyed by a most just extermination.
some of the victims of this extermination may now have been discovered by archaeologists in a pit in Oxford. The skeletons of at least 35 people lay in a mass grave where they'd been dumped 1,000 years before.
It is very rare that archaeologists get the chance to examine evidence from a particular historical event, and one that the scholars agree did actually happen. But I'm interested in the analysis of these bones. Do the bones show evidence of violence? Could they indeed represent the victims of this massacre?
Osteologist Kerry Fallis has been examining their remains for signs of trauma.
This was actually the first skeleton that we found, but it wasn't until we placed his skull back together, because it was in hundreds of fragments, that we actually saw the trauma. There's at least 10 blade wounds.
So there's a blade wound here, here, there, so that's 3.
There's a glancing wound here.
And what about these little triangular holes?
They're puncture wounds made by maybe a spear or something like that.
It is awful, isn't it? I mean, you hold these bones, and these are the bones of somebody who died a very long time ago, but you're suddenly kind of connecting with this awful moment, which is his death.
Radiocarbon dating has shown that these people died between 998 and 1019 AD, which means it's possible they were killed on St. Brice's Day, 1002, the day the Anglo-Saxons turned on the Danes.
And he also has 2 puncture wounds to his back There's one there, and one a bit farther down.
So these are quite tiny puncture wounds into the spine. What do you think they could have been caused by?
Possibly by a spear, something being thrust rather than thrown.
Yeah, so just the tip of the spear being pushed in. Yeah. Again, a young man hacked to death. Horrendous.
Most of these men were between 16 and 25 years old when they died. Incredibly, the next skeleton I'm shown is that of a man whose murder was even more vicious than the last.
His ear, just behind his ear, has been sheared off.
Oh yeah, so straight through that mastoid process, that chunk of bone behind the ear.
The side of his mandible's been sheared off.
So there's evidence of blade injury here as well?
Yeah, there's 2 definite blade wounds on that side of the jaw. He's got 4 wounds to his upper neck.
So that's been chopped through,
yeah. And the dens itself.
So chopping through just underneath the ear, taking off the angle of the mandible, and then the blade carrying on through and cutting into the vertebrae of the neck.
Yeah.
Other parts of this man's skeleton show further signs of the frenzied nature of the attack.
He has 3 punctures to his pelvis. There's 2 small wounds there, but they've actually come in from the back. You can see these very square-shaped puncture wounds, which have gone all the way through the bone.
So these are the tips of a weapon of some kind, which are pushing all the way through to here.
Yeah.
So he was attacked from the back there, so on the left side, somebody stabbed him just above the hip on the back, and then he's also been speared or stabbed through from the front as well, from about here, going in and then hitting his pelvis as it passes backwards. So he's being attacked from all angles.
All angles.
And if the multiple stab wounds weren't enough to finish this man off, for good measure, he was set on fire.
His forehead has been burnt, which accounts for the missing bone in the middle, and also his hand has been charred.
Is this the only skeleton who has signs of burning?
No, quite a few of them have got charring.
Yeah.
It's mostly to their heads, their pelvises, and their hands.
Terry, were you shocked when you got these bones cleaned up and into the laboratory at how much violence there was represented on them?
Very shocked. I've never seen anything like this before.
Yeah.
And just to have so many different weapons used on one individual.
These skeletons bore none of the wounds you'd expect to find on people who tried to defend themselves, so it's likely that they were murdered whilst running away. But were they Vikings? Isotope analysis was not conclusive, but did show that their diet was rich in seafood, suggesting they did at least live a Viking way of life. And then they may have been hunted down and killed for it.
So what can we say for certain? We have over 30 skeletons, all of them men, all showing signs of extreme violence. Whilst we can't be sure that they were the victims of the St Brice's Day massacre, the types of injury and the date of the skeletons makes it at least possible. These young men were cut down, were hacked to death in a frenzy of violence. And 1,000 years on, this mass murder is still shocking.
Through trauma analysis, archaeology has allowed us to explore the awful possibility of the Vikings as victims. But a different kind of archaeological discovery has opened a window onto life for a Viking whose luck had run out.
Every now and then, metal detectorists turn up interesting objects which have been lost or abandoned or even deliberately buried by their owners, and then they've laid hidden in the ground for hundreds of years. But it's extremely unusual to find a collection as diverse and which illustrates as many different aspects of a past society as the hoard I'm about to see now.
It's one of the most important Viking finds of the last 150 years, and it's so rich in content that experts are still writing up their findings. It's currently on display at the Yorkshire Museum.
So this is it. This is the Vale of York hoard. It was found 4 years ago by a father and son metal detecting team,
And it really is an astonishing collection of silver objects with one piece of gold. But what's really amazing is that most of those objects were found inside that cup. It really is spectacular and beautiful, but what I want to know is, can we learn anything of any real archaeological significance from these objects? And given what we know about this period of history in this area, might we be able to get an idea of the person who had this sort of wealth in their possession?
The hoard comprises 617 coins and 67 pieces of silver, including items of jewellery, all objects which have a great deal to tell us about the Scandinavian world at the time of their burial.
This cup is absolutely extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah, it's I think probably the finest thing in the hoard, all on its own. It's gilt silver cup, so it's silver and it's been gilded with gold. It was also decorated with niello, which is a kind of alloy that's black. So when this was first made, it would have been, if you think of a wasp, a kind of quite gaudy yellow and black contrast. So the detail would have showed up amazingly well. Would you like to hold it?
I'd love to hold it.
If you sit it in your hands, it kind of gives you a real good impression of what this might have been used for when it was originally made.
It feels like a cup which wants to be passed on to somebody else. Yeah. What do you think it was used for?
Given the way that you hold it in both hands, the fact that it's been gilded and it may have had a lid, we think that it could be an ecclesiastical vessel, something that was used in a monastery.
So it's possible that this cup, which experts believe came from the Frankish Empire, fell into Viking hands as loot or in payment of tribute. It was made in the mid-9th century, predating the rest of the objects in this collection.
But it presumably had a lot of special significance and meaning because it lasted another 100 years, so I presume it was passed down through the family and then came to, hold the contents of this hoard.
This object gives us a rare insight into the mindset of a Viking. As an heirloom, it connects him back to his adventuring ancestors and their ill-gotten gains. But not all of the items in this hoard had sentimental value.
So what about these objects that were inside it then? Are these pieces of jewellery typically Viking in nature?
They are, yes. This is by far the most spectacular.
That's the gold. That's the only gold piece, isn't it?
This is the only gold piece in the hoard. And if you'd like to hold it.
Gosh, that's heavy.
It is. It's quite a chunky thing.
This single piece is a marker of extreme wealth. Finding gold in Viking hoards is exceptionally rare. Only someone of the highest social standing would have had access to it.
And there are some complete items of jewellery, but then there seem to be a lot of pieces. This bit in particular, that just looks like a brooch or something that's been cut in half.
And this is very typical of the way the Vikings did things. They had a lot of what we call hack silver.
The Viking economy was based on the barter and exchange of silver. It was highly prized by the Vikings and valued by its weight and purity. Before being chopped up and used as currency, silver could be worn and transported as jewellery.
This is what we call a penannular brooch. If you think of this as the terminal at one end, it would thin out, come in a big spiral, and then fatten out again at the other end.
Right.
And you would have a huge pin through the middle, and that would sit on your cloak to keep your cloak together. And this is a particularly beautiful example, I think. It's got these lovely little roundels and it's kind of this really delicate interlaced pattern.
Yeah, and actually it's made of looks like little beasts, which are kind of chasing their tails around.
Very popular in kind of Viking iconography, these little beasties.
The Vikings travelled thousands of miles across vast, sweeping trade routes to get their silver. And some pieces within this hoard connect the Vikings here in Britain with trading centres as far away as the Islamic world.
Oh, that looks like Arabic script on there.
It does. This is called a dirham, and it's Islamic coin.
It really is?
It is, and it comes from Afghanistan.
Wow. So this is evidence of Vikings trading all the way over to the Middle East?
Absolutely, yeah.
One other coin here sheds light on the moment this hoard was buried. It's a coin of the English King Athelstan, minted in 927 AD, just after he captured York from the Vikings. And judging by the lack of wear on its surface, it was placed in the ground almost immediately.
And if you look very closely, you'll be able to see that this coin actually has the words Rex To Brie. So R-E-X-T-O-B-R-I-E.
Oh, yeah, I can see that.
That basically means King of all Britain. So this coin proclaims Athelstan as the King of all Britain. So he used this coin to say that he'd got rid of the Vikings and he'd unified the country and made it into one kingdom.
But although the English king stamped his identity on his coins, the name of the person who owned these riches is lost to us. All we have are the clues passed down by his cherished possessions. This hoard of beautiful objects raises the tantalising possibility that what we're looking at is the treasure, the life savings of a man whose days amongst the ruling classes in northern England are numbered. And the hoard dates from precisely the time when there's this changeover of power between the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons. So are we looking at a Viking running away and burying his wealth for safety? All that we can be sure about is that he never returned to dig it up. Govan in Glasgow might seem like an unlikely place to come looking for Viking archaeology, but I'm here to see what is perhaps the most extensive collection of Norse artefacts from any Viking site anywhere in rural Britain. Now, these objects are not treasure, they are domestic items, things that Viking men and women would have used every day of their lives. And they're also at the beginning of their story because they've been excavated, but the examination, the interpretation of them is very much still a work in progress. So what I want to find out is the potential of this collection for helping us understand Viking everyday life.
The actual material is fine, but as you see from the package...
Beverly Ballin-Smith has a huge archaeological task ahead of her, the processing and recording of all the small finds from a site called the Udal in North Uist, the largest Norse settlement ever to have been excavated in the Western Isles. It was a monumental project which involved a dedicated group of volunteers who returned to dig again and again over a 30-year period starting in 1963. But the significance of the site is still only partially understood. I don't think I have ever seen so many bone needles, and I imagine we're just starting.
So, you wanted to have a look at...
that little poppy one?
Yeah, sure.
Can we take it out?
Yeah. Want to?
Oh, look at that. That's really lovely. What are these made of?
I think that's a bird bone. It's pretty, isn't it?
It's really lovely, yeah. There are hundreds of decorated bone pins here, perhaps a reflection of their value in everyday life as something to fix a Viking's hair in place or to fasten his cloak. That's fantastic.
In a sense, all these are lost objects.
Yes, things that have just dropped off people.
Dropped off people and not...
And they go, where did that go? And they've trod it into the mud, and then archaeologists find it centuries later. Wow. It's not unusual to find combs in a Viking settlement. They're commonplace personal objects. What's surprising about this collection, though, is the sheer number of them found on one site. Oh, that's fantastic. It's got a little animal on it.
A little horse's head, I think.
And I love these roundels, which are obviously kind of drilled into the bone. I think you look at things like this and you have this immediate contact with somebody who lived centuries ago and this was their comb. And you also know that you have the same kind of sensibilities that, you know, I quite like to have things that are nice. I like to have objects which aren't just functional, but
yes,
actually which are quite attractive as well.
Yes.
The massive task of excavating this site and all the finds buried there was effectively the life's work of historian and archaeologist Ian Crawford. But unable to continue with his task due to ill health, it's now fallen to Beverly. But he ended up amassing a huge collection of finds that you're still looking through now. So he obviously became... what happened? Did he become overwhelmed with the amount he was finding?
I've been there myself. When you work on a massive site with complicated stratigraphy. So he carried on digging. He produced interim reports for every year that he dug. But then there's the next stage of actually writing up and getting the information out to the public. And I think he was simply overwhelmed.
Even since my visit, fresh research has suggested the volume of beautiful combs may be proof of a Viking comb-making industry here. It reinforces just how important the research into the udel will be in years to come. It's great to see just a small part of this massive collection of everyday objects. They seem mundane in some ways, but they also show that just like us, the Vikings like to have nice things. And it's fantastic that this collection is being revisited. Archaeologically speaking, there's still an enormous amount to be learned about this site and all the artefacts it contained. And there must be people on North Uist who remember digging at that site in the dunes. And I imagine it's important to them to know that the last chapters in the story of Udal are finally being written. Off the northeastern shore of Scotland lie the islands of Orkney, colonised by the Vikings in the 9th century. Sailing from their Norwegian homelands, it would have taken the Norse longships about a day to get here. And when they settled for good, the islands became the centre of Norse power in Scotland, right up until 1469, the last bastion of Scandinavian authority in Britain. Today, these islands are home to a classic Norse archaeological find, and also to new excavations that are offering tantalising glimpses of the Vikings in Scotland. My first destination is the dig currently taking place in the east of Orkney's mainland, near its ancient capital, Kirkwall. It sits on top of a 30-metre-high stack of sheer rock, the Broch of Dearness, which even today is challenging to access. This is such a wild place. There's nothing here but cliffs, sea and birds. And I'm walking up this path that I can't imagine was here 1,000 years ago. So I do wonder how people got across from the land there to the Broch. This is such an exposed place. It's a lovely day today, but imagine this on a rainy, windswept day. The Broch is totally exposed to the legendary Orcadian winds. What an extreme place to choose as your home. Whether coming from the mainland or from ships secured in a nearby bay, getting here can't have been straightforward. The old path up the Broch has disappeared into the sea. So we're now coming up through the original entrance to the site.
Exactly.
Can we go and have a look at
of course we can.
Some of the archaeology that you're exploring? There was once a settlement of around 30 Viking houses up here, and Dr. James Barrett and his team are excavating one of them this season. So would this have been the original doorway?
This is the original doorway of the phase that we're excavating right now. So there was a settlement here before the Vikings came, and the ground level at that point was at the top of that layer. And then the Viking Age houses were literally dug into the ground.
Right.
And lined with stone walls, what you see here, and then above that at ground level, the rest of the house would have been built in turf and timber.
It's likely that the Vikings dug their homes so deep into the ground to withstand the extreme winds that often blow here. And evidence of life inside one of those homes came to light during my visit. Oh, wow. Oh, my goodness.
Right, so we're just going to come in here and
That's just beautiful. It's moments like these that make archaeology so rewarding, discovering an unexpected find, a forgotten part of somebody's life.
If you start cleaning off most of this loose around it,
That's fantastic.
This is just brilliant. This is a Viking gaming board that was thrown away, that was thrown into this rubbish pit, this midden, that we've just found in the corner of the trench. And it's wonderful to hold something that was obviously a very personal object to somebody, something that they would have enjoyed using 1,000 years ago.
It looks like a board for playing the popular Viking game Nefertafel. It's something that might have kept people occupied in place of looking after crops or farming animals, a task that would have been impossible up here. So their food must have been brought in from other farms or settlements nearby, and only someone of the higher status could have demanded this of their neighbours, perhaps a Viking chief and his retinue. But it does beg the question, why live in such a difficult spot?
The way it works is what you see. It's a site that is all about seeing and being seen. And when people ask me why were they here, when I want to give a glib answer, it's to make a point. It gives you extraordinary control of the maritime vantage. And in addition to that, you will be seen. So if you imagine a large hall here, then if you're coming into the archipelago, you immediately know who you have to go and talk to. You know who's boss.
I am quite taken by this ancient cliff-top settlement. It seems such an extraordinary place to live, so wild and windy, with these crashing waves all around. The men and women who lived up here must have been very isolated in some ways, but on the other hand, they can't have survived here on their own. They depended on support from people living on mainland Orkney. But who were they?
One of the reasons the Vikings seem so mysterious is that they left few written records in Britain. But it's wrong to think they didn't write. They used runes. And last year, James found a tiny bronze strip with a mysterious message etched into its surface. Professor John Hines examined it to see if he could make some sense of it.
It takes quite a while getting used to it, but once you get your eye in to these things, you start seeing certain letters that we're familiar with. So if you look on it here, we've got, see that letter like that? That's fairly clear. Then there's a very clearly what we'd call an I, then another K, then we've got an U at the end of that.
Some letters in the Scandinavian runic alphabet resemble our own, and others are more cryptic. To make it even more difficult, they changed over time, and experts continue to discover new letters and symbols.
Unfortunately, going across all of the bits that I can read, I just cannot put enough together to form coherent words and coherent strings of words. Interestingly, practically every mark that we've got on that we can identify as being the sort of things they were using as runes. They've abbreviated what they're writing rather like people who are younger than me do when they send text messages and I try and work out what they're actually saying there.
It's frustrating to be so close and yet so far away from knowing what's been written down by this Viking living on the Broch of Dyrness, a message from Scandinavian Orkney that we'll probably never decipher.
The Norse archaeology I've seen in Orkney has shown me some of the purest evidence of that culture, because when the Vikings came here, they transplanted their entire way of life from Norway.
And this year's research has unearthed unexpected evidence of this Viking lifestyle, of how they settled and shaped our landscape as well as raiding here. Evidence like the ivory chessman, carved in a Norwegian workshop, tangible proof of a wealthy, forgotten kingdom. The buried life savings of a powerful Viking whose wealth connects us to vast trading empires. And the horrific St. Brice's Day massacre, when men may have been killed just for being Scandinavian. Through its invaders, Britain became firmly connected with the continent and beyond. And archaeology helps us understand how these outsiders came and enriched our culture and ended up becoming British. And so the digging continues. We might be a small island, but we've got an epic history. And there's a wealth of untold secrets still to uncover. So every year, hundreds of archaeologists dig, dive and sift to find clues.
Absolutely never seen anything like it before. It's just amazing.
In 2018, their discoveries have been more exciting than ever.
Look at that.
So that's from a tank then? That's brilliant. That's a nice find.
Not bad for day 2.
Not bad at all.
Each excavation has been filmed as it happened by the archaeologists themselves. Their dig diaries mean that we can be there for every exciting moment of discovery.
And imagine him looking over his shoulder, trying to get away from the enemy aircraft through that.
I'll be in the lab where the teams will bring in their finds from pottery and metalwork to human remains, and we'll take a closer look to find out what these new digs can tell us about our ancestors. Look at that!
Be very careful.
I will be careful. Oh my goodness. While archaeologist Raksha Dave looks into the analysis that goes on long after a dig is finished.
Somebody stabbed her in the back of the head. What an awful way to go.
Welcome to Digging for Britain. In this programme, I'm joining archaeologists in the north of the country to share in their biggest discoveries.
Yes!
We go on a hunt for a lost Spitfire from the Second World War.
The instrument panel.
No!
Yeah!
That is new star find.
And we follow the excavation of a recently identified Anglo-Saxon cemetery with some very unusual grave goods.
That's quite some bling.
I've come to the National Museum of Scotland to see how these discoveries are rewriting British history, and I've been given behind-the-scenes access to explore parts of the collections rarely seen by the public. I'll have the chance to get up close and personal with some of Britain's most intriguing treasures. Our first dig takes us to Dumfries and Galloway in southwest Scotland, and the Black Loch of Merton, where a perfectly preserved 2,500-year-old village is emerging from the mud. Moving back into prehistory, it is very rare to find actual evidence of the houses our ancestors lived in. Timber rots away, and very often all that we have left are imprints in the ground. But the amazing wetland preservation at Blackloch means that we have a chance to see what village life in Britain was really like 2,500 years ago. Back in 2016, Digging for Britain got privileged access as a team of archaeologists unearthed a remarkable lost village. From out of the mud, they revealed intriguing sections of wood that had been skillfully crafted into planks, and they were in incredible condition.
Wow, that's amazing. So this is the notch that's been cut to fit around the lower framework?
Yes! All right.
Well done.
The finds were so spectacular that we're joining them again as they return to this prehistoric Pompeii for their 5th season. Archaeologists Anne Crone and Graham Cavers have been the site directors from the very beginning.
We've got lots of Iron Age sites throughout Scotland, but to have this level of preservation on a site of this date is very rare indeed, and I would say that it's probably a once-in-a-lifetime chance to excavate under these conditions.
Using the remains of the roundhouses dug up over the last 4 seasons, the archaeologists have built up a detailed picture of the village, and they discovered that these homes once sat on the peaty edge of a loch that had been drained in the 19th century. It's an extraordinary window into Iron Age life. But so far, they haven't found any personal possessions. And this year they're going to dig where they think they're most likely to find them: inside the houses. They soon make a remarkable discovery: an intact floor made of woven rushes and withies. This is ancient matting.
It looks like chipboard. It's so fresh. It's just layer upon layer of brush, sedges, reeds and things like this, which have just been compacted down.
The discovery of the matting gives us an incredible opportunity to glimpse the skills of our ancient ancestors and their efforts to insulate their homes and make them cosy in these inhospitable conditions. And now they've got a floor surface, there's a tantalising prospect that they may find personal items. They eventually make a breakthrough.
Anne, what is it?
I have no idea. It looks like it's a piece of spindle-turned wood.
Anne has found an intriguing piece of clearly worked wood.
Oh, wow.
Has it got a hole? It's got a hole there.
Never seen anything
like it before.
That's amazing.
We're just removing the very sort of thick layer of laminated flooring materials. I was about to start pickaxing, and this is just lying on one of the surfaces within this house.
Discovering what this artefact is could give the team valuable insights into daily life at Blackloch. And then there's another extraordinary find in a rubbish pit located next to one of the houses.
Oh wow, I can see the decoration.
Squash. Extremely rare.
Oh yeah.
My heart actually skipped a bit when I saw it.
This exquisitely decorated wooden object was found deep in the pit.
That's the rim here. So you've got two pieces and then one piece that goes this way. And then here is the rim on the other side.
Although squashed flat and in several pieces, the team knows what this is. It's a beautiful and rare lathe-turned wooden bowl.
Well, this has to be the star find of the entire 5 years of excavation so far.
The team's discoveries have given us an unprecedented new insight into the lives of the people who lived here at Blackloch. It's been an extraordinary dig. I've asked Anne Crone into the lab to discuss her findings. And this site is just amazing. I mean, that preservation that you're getting and being able to see not just how the houses were constructed, but starting to find some of the artefacts of everyday life as well.
Most of the time it's been the preservation of the structural remains, but that's really changed this year when we started finding wooden artefacts for the first time. So, yeah. I know.
I mean, it looks so modern. I still find it hard to believe that this is a prehistoric artefact, but you're quite sure about the date of it.
Oh, absolutely. Well, it came out of very closely stratified deposits, and we have radiocarbon dated the deposit that it came from, and it's 2,500 years old.
That's just crazy.
Yeah. It's made of yew, which is a beautiful wood to carve. It's a spindle-turned object, so it's been sort of mounted with mandrels on either end there. It's very clearly designed for something, but I can only speculate as to what it is.
So these objects were just found in the floor. I mean, do you think that's just happened by accident?
No, I think these objects have been deliberately placed in the floor surfaces of this structure, possibly reflecting the function that the house has during its current phase. So perhaps if this is to do with weaving, that it was a weaving workshop during that phase.
And that's a beautiful bowl. So this is a turned bowl which has then been decorated.
Yeah. It's lathe turned. It's probably complete but flattened, and so what you're looking at is a reconstruction. It's an absolutely beautiful object. It seems to be unique in the UK at the moment. I've not heard of any other lathe-turned bowls. Its shape and the decoration, which is stunning, is really unusual. Never seen anything like that before. Until we found this, we didn't have very clear evidence for lathe turning in the Iron Age, but it's very clear from this bowl that not only were they doing it, but they've been doing it for a very long time, because this is so accomplished. Yes, so they're very good at it. Yeah. And similarly with the baton as well.
How extraordinary to turn up those two objects, which, as you say, are utterly unique in Britain in one digging season. Yeah.
You wonder what else is out there. We're going to be able to look much more carefully at what's going on inside the houses, what sort of activities are taking place, and get closer to the people.
And how wonderfully close you got this year with that bowl and this, whatever it is, strange but very beautiful object.
Answers on a postcard, please.
Yeah. The dig at this very special Iron Age site allows us to see that our prehistoric ancestors were perhaps more technologically advanced than we've previously thought. Our next investigation takes us on the hunt for an RAF Spitfire lost on a World War II reconnaissance assignment. And it sheds light on a forgotten hero. On the 5th of March 1942, Flight Lieutenant Alistair Gunn took off from the RAF base at Wick in northeast Scotland. He was on a highly dangerous top-secret mission ordered by Winston Churchill, and it was a mission that he wouldn't return from alive. Gunn was tasked with monitoring the activity around the German battleship Tirpitz, which Hitler was using to intercept the Allied forces' merchant fleet. But only a few hours in, Alistair was shot down over the mountains near the Trondheim Fjord in Norway. The Spitfire is arguably our most iconic fighter plane, famous, of course, for the role it played during the airborne conflict that was the Battle of Britain. But there is another side to the Spitfire's story. Reconnaissance Spitfires, like the one flown by Flight Lieutenant Alistair Gunn, played a vital role bringing key intelligence back to Britain. But these planes are now extremely rare. So finding this one would be a real coup. Nearly 80 years after it went down, aircraft engineer Tony Hoskins is driving all the way from Britain to Norway to lead the search.
It's the earliest model photo reconnaissance machine that was designed, so we know we're onto something really quite special here. So it is literally on the other side of that hill. I'm very excited.
With a team of historians, engineers and aviation enthusiasts, Tony hopes to find the exact spot where Gunn's plane crashed, bringing us close to the gritty realities faced by the RAF's brave reconnaissance pilots. It's a daunting task, and the team have only 3 days to find and recover the plane.
Anxious. Definitely anxious. It's 3 kilometres and about 1,000 metres climb, and of course we're coming back down with a significant amount of Spitfire.
Tony knows that Gunn's plane was shot down somewhere over these mountains, and he's narrowed down the location using German accounts and local reports to find the crash site.
I've just stood on a piece. There's more here, there's steel down there, it's just everywhere.
Luckily for the team, there's more wreckage than they'd ever hoped for.
This is the radiator door, and that's really lovely. Considering it sat here for 76 years, that's in astonishingly good condition.
Suddenly, one of the team finds something that brings them even closer to Flight Lieutenant Gunn's final moments before he bailed out.
So this is a piece of the canopy, the perspex. So this was last looked through by Gunn, 5th of March 1942. And you imagine him looking over his shoulder, trying to get away from the enemy aircraft through that. Absolutely fantastic to find a bit of canopy.
Every piece that they salvage will help reveal how this particular Spitfire was stripped back and streamlined as a reconnaissance machine.
That's amazing.
Very good fun.
Incredible. Yeah, because that's almost the mount for its headrest. You can't get more in the cockpit than that.
Star item.
Because that is a brilliant piece.
With nearly 19 hours of daylight in Norway's summer months, Tony and his team could just keep digging, but they know they've got to leave enough time to carry the recovered pieces back down the mountain. The next morning, they're back.
This looks like the oxygen bottle.
1940 date on it.
These oxygen canisters allowed the reconnaissance pilots to fly higher than their fighter counterparts. The discovery of key reconnaissance items is a boost, but Tony soon realises that they need to widen the search area.
So we were hoping that a lot of it had gone bang into here, whereas it appears it's exploded and scattered over a wide area.
Although the team now have more ground to cover, the new search area pays dividends.
Shit. There we go. Well done. Head on. Instrument panel. Yeah. This is what they call the blind flying panel from the middle of the cockpit. This is the artificial horizon with its casing. So when you're flying in cloud, he would be able to know whether he's banking, climbing or descending.
That is new star find. Alistair Gunn's blind flying panel. Very careful. That's the aeroplane portion. And that, oh look.
Artificial horizon?
Artificial horizon. What do you want to find? Say something directly relates to him. The instrument panel.
And it's in one piece. Can't believe that. I really can't believe that. Amazing, isn't it?
They're clearly delighted to have found such a recognisable fragment, the instrument panel from Gunn's cockpit.
Well, thank you very much. We've had a fantastic day. We've managed to get about 2/3 of what we found today off, but we think the new areas that we found around are going to continue to give.
It's the final day of the dig and the team have only hours left. But what they want more than anything, what for them is the holy grail, is the reconnaissance camera.
Oi! Wow!
Wow, what's this?
Oi!
This is maybe some electrical coil, maybe?
Tony!
This is interesting.
Cameras could be here. The writing on the top says heater, front, lens, camera. 14 and 20-inch lenses. That's right, camera f/24. So it carried 14-inch lens.
Could you find the film, please?
Yeah.
We'd like to get it developed.
Yeah, no problem.
Finding the camera mount takes the team right to the heart of Gunn's mission. The photos taken by reconnaissance Spitfires played a key role in the Allies' success. But of course the photos from this camera, as Gunn himself, never made it back. I've invited Tony Hoskins and colleague Mark Hillier into the lab to take a closer look at this strategically important plane and to uncover the story of its brave pilot. Tony, I think the first question to ask is, how on earth did you know where to start looking for this Spitfire?
Well, it was a long process. We had the combat report from the German who shot him down, so we knew a rough area to start looking in, and then thankfully local knowledge proved to be the way forward. Although it's not a big aeroplane when you compare it to a mountain, it's going to be all in the same kind of area. It ends up being a bigger area than we thought, but we came away with 70% of the aeroplane.
So what are we looking at here? Which part of the aircraft is this from?
So this section is from the wing. So this is a wing skin on the top, and what's interesting about this part is that you can see the PR blue. So all the photographic reconnaissance aircraft at that time were painted in this for camouflage.
Yeah.
And this is the roundel, so the identity markings that he carried on the aircraft, just so that you didn't get any friendly fire. So obviously that's really important in terms of identifying it as British, and the colour is right as well for a photographic reconnaissance Spitfire.
And would they have been blue all over then?
The same colour, top surface and underside, were all blue, exactly that.
Yeah.
Some of the photographic reconnaissance aircraft later on were painted pink.
Where were they pink?
Desert mostly, wasn't it? Yeah, and
for the sunrise in the morning and the dust in the sky.
Yeah,
It becomes pinky.
And it was stripped back in order to do this, was it?
That's right. I mean, then he built 220 of them, so it's a very rare item.
Yeah, they were unsung heroes if you think that they were often flying 4.5 hours, sometimes long sorties over water on their own, 30,000 feet, and unarmed. So obviously when they got to the target area, there's always the risk of enemy aircraft and being shot down, as Alistair found out to his cost.
Yeah. And you found not the camera itself, so this is a camera off another plane, presumably.
So it carried 3 cameras. It carried 1 that pointed out the side and 2 that pointed out the bottom.
Yeah.
And it was the very first setup for making 3D photographs, and that these would be mounted in a frame. And we've got the frame. That's the frame at the front.
So that is part
That's part of the frame that mounted the camera. Yeah. So that frame would have looped around the top up here.
Yeah.
And then Alistair would have set it in on a dial for the height that he was clear of cloud and could see the target, and then the cameras would have motored to give 2 angles that would have focused at the ground at that point.
Just how important was photo reconnaissance at this time?
I think people underestimate the importance of it if you think this was the intelligence gathering arm of all the armed forces. And even the RAF today, you know, photographic reconnaissance is really key and massively important.
And then you've got this amazing insight into the cockpit that Alistair was sitting in, and this is the housing for his instruments.
Really important piece of the cockpit, and also the engine instruments round to the right. But just to think that he was in the cockpit, you know, in 1942, the last person looking at those instruments. This is part of the fuselage, and it's just from the cockpit section, just about where Alistair was sat, and the machine gun round has come through the cockpit, and this is the exit point from the side of the fuselage. It tells quite a grim story of the last few moments of his struggle to get away from the Germans. And then obviously, eventually, he lost that fight and had to bail out of the aircraft.
So he bails out, he parachutes, he survives this. What happens to him eventually?
He'd spent a night in a hut on the hill on the night of the 5th, and then, despite the help of the locals, he took the decision it was best to hand himself in. Eventually, he was sent to Tintagel 3, which was the camp made famous in the film The Great Escape.
Yeah.
And he got involved with the tunnelling committee and dug first one tunnel, which was discovered by the Germans, and then embarked on a second rather famous tunnel, which was the Tunnel Harry.
But did he make it out?
He did escape in the tunnel, but they got to within 25 kilometres of the port they were going to use to get to Sweden when he was discovered. He was writing letters home to his parents, and sadly his last letter he wrote was on the 19th of March, 44. Of course, he escaped on the night, the 24th, 25th, and the letter arrived at his parents' house on the 15th of May. But sadly, the next day, on the 16th of May, was the telegram from the War Office saying that he'd been executed.
That's just horrendous. I mean, he astonishingly brave.
They're often forgotten about, so this story is really important. Not just Alistair's, but all of the PRU pilots too. It's fantastic.
That's the thing, isn't it? It's not just about going and recovering pieces of metal from the side of a mountain. It's about recovering this story and remembering him. The discovery of this Spitfire by Tony and his team has graphically underlined just how risky these vital reconnaissance missions were. The fragments of Alistair Gunn's plane recovered from that Norwegian mountainside are a memorial to just one of World War II's forgotten heroes. Our next investigation takes us to the Roman fort of Vindolanda in Northumberland. Vindolanda is near Hadrian's Wall, the northernmost frontier of the Roman Empire. For almost 300 years, its numerous forts were key to the stability of military rule in this inhospitable and dangerous no-man's land. Roman sites are invariably rich in finds, but very few in Britain have delivered the sheer range of artefacts that we've found at Vindolanda, from swords to sandals and even handwritten notes from the soldiers themselves. Now, people have been digging at Vindolanda for decades, revealing the rich and layered history of the Romans in Britain. But can this year's dig uncover fresh insights about a particularly turbulent episode during those centuries of Roman rule? This summer, archaeologists have been digging into the ditches, Vindolanda's frontline defences, where the discoveries have been spectacular.
Look at that beauty.
And it's all down to the anaerobic conditions in this soil. Behind the scenes, post-excavation work is transforming our knowledge of one of the most turbulent times in the history of Vindolanda, the 2nd century Civil War. Archaeologist Raksha Dave is getting a privileged look at the conservation work taking place during this year's digging season.
Every archaeologist dreams of working on a site like Vindolanda. Each object that's uncovered is so precious that it makes their post-excavation labs like the emergency rooms of archaeology. Each object needs conservation immediately, or else its secrets could be lost forever.
I'm going to follow the process of conservation from start to finish. But while I wait for something to turn up in the trenches, I've met up with Site Director Andrew Burley to find out more about this year's mission.
Andrew, what are you actually concentrating on this year?
Well, we're focusing at the end of the 2nd century and the beginning of the 3rd century, when we have a Roman army in Britain trying to suppress rebels, but they're also fighting amongst themselves. In the ditches, we're getting evidence of things that are tossed away during that very brief but intense period of time. And it's a little sort of Vindolanda Pompeii, because it's only occupied for a few years, but everything is sealed, so it's giving us a lovely slice of life.
Back in the trenches, the digging team make a discovery in the 2nd century Antonine ditch. So Andrew and I head over to see what they found.
Oh, I can actually see it now. So I can see
the soul coming
this way.
bending around. That's it. There it is.
Yay!
Another Roman shoe at Vindolanda.
There was a bit of a shoe the other day, but this is the first complete one. Fantastic feeling. Thrown away by somebody 1900 years ago. Fabulous to find it.
Now the shoe is out of the ground, every second counts. So I'm taking it over to Barbara Burley in the Vindolanda Conservation Lab. She's going to show me what happens next.
Shall we open it up and have a look?
Yeah, I'm really excited to have a look at it, actually.
Probably a man's shoe by initial inspection. Wow, look at that. And you've even got the heel strengthener just here. Shall we get it washed up and have a look at it?
Yeah, I'd love to.
Barbara separates the very fragile shoe from its mud cocoon, using a soft brush and water.
So you do this process almost immediately?
We try to do it as fast as we can because they will continue to degrade until we put them into some sort of chemical bath, especially the organic objects like the leather.
Barbara has given me a child's shoe to clean. I don't normally get a post-excavation opportunity, so I'm looking forward to this.
Am I using just cold water or can I use hot as well?
We don't want it to be too hot because that could actually kind of shock leather.
Right, okay.
Here goes. The next step is to put them in these mesh bags that we've got. We use these bags in order to keep any sort of little bits that come off of it into the bucket here.
It is then preserved using a cocktail of chemicals, including acetone, which stabilises the leather. The whole process takes over 5 hours, but once completed, the shoe will be preserved for posterity and go on show in the museum with some of the other remarkable finds from the excavations. Back at the fort, I meet with Andrew to find out more about the recent shoe discoveries in the ditches.
So what do the shoes tell us about this particular period of conflict?
If we look at all of them together, and there's almost 1,000 of them now from this particular period, 45% are non-adult male shoes. In other words, they're children, they're women, they're teenagers, and that just changes the whole nature and the complexion of what was going on, what it was like to be part of this community.
It's really hard to imagine that those women and children would have seen exactly the same horrors as the men that were stationed here.
Some of the things they will have seen are horrendous. We have evidence here of people who've had their heads cut off and mounted on poles on the ramparts. And if you're a little child running around, that's the kind of thing that you're going to see.
The analysis of these shoes has given us a fresh understanding of the people who lived here at Vindolanda during those turbulent years. And it's given us a new take on the horrors endured by the inhabitants of this fort at the time.
Our next dig takes us to Scremby, on the tip of the Lincolnshire Wolds, and a discovery which could fill in some gaps about what we know about Britain after the Romans left, a period sometimes known as the Dark Ages. Around 1500 years ago, so history tells us, Britain was invaded by wave upon wave of Germanic tribes, the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, and they transformed our country, giving us the English language and the basis of our laws. But actually, there is very little in the way of written records from the time. So if we want to understand Anglo-Saxon society and its cultural connections, we have to turn to archaeology. And this next excavation gives us a chance to find out more. Last year, local landowner and metal detectorist Jim Hoff was exploring fields next to his home, where he came across some rare and intriguing objects. A small team of archaeologists from the University of Sheffield started to investigate, and it wasn't long before they uncovered some graves dating to the late 5th, early 6th centuries, packed with jewellery and other precious goods. The discovery was so rich and so intriguing that this year they're returning for a full excavation led by Hugh Wilmot.
Here we are at Scremby, and let's go and look at the site. So one of the questions we've got here is, the people who are buried here, were they born here in Lincolnshire? Are they sort of second-generation migrants? Or perhaps their ancestors have always lived here and they've just adopted new styles and fashions of the incoming Anglo-Saxons? And these are all questions we can hopefully answer from the grave goods they've been buried with, but also some of the science we can do back in the lab.
Analysing the skeletons and the objects buried with them should provide insights into whether these people were British natives or immigrants. The team has stripped a large area and have already identified a number of graves in the ground.
Possibly there's the fill of another grave coming through here.
After last year's dig, they're expecting some great finds from the site, and they're not disappointed.
It's the second day and we've just started excavating some of the graves. And here we've got one leg running down here, quite a large femur there, and lying right next to it here is a huge spearhead. And it dates to about 525 to about 550 AD, and it's the largest kind of spear you're going to see in the Anglo-Saxon world.
As the team targets some of the other graves, they are rewarded with even more exotic finds.
We have this pretty well preserved skeleton of an adult female. Down at her hip, she's got the remains of an ivory bag ring, and this went round the mouth of a sort of fabric bag that would have hung from her hip. And inside it are all sorts of artefacts.
Ivory was a rare commodity in Anglo-Saxon Britain, but this isn't the first ring to be uncovered here.
We found one elephant ivory bag ring last year, and already, just over a week into the dig, we found two more. So what stage are we at with this one, Megan?
Well, we're going to lift the copper brooch and this other tube bead,
Right.
and then the girdle hanger.
Oh, wow. I think that's the nicest one we've got so far.
After 1,500 years in the ground, the ring is extremely delicate.
Beautiful. Well done.
Good job, team.
And now lifted, it'll be sent to the lab for analysis.
So one of the things we can do, which is quite simple, is radiocarbon date the elephant ivory to see how old it is. Now, if it's sort of 6th century in date, it probably tells us it's coming from Africa. But if it ends up being sort of 10,000 BC, they must be reusing mammoth ivory. So that's quite an easy one to test out.
And pieces of exquisite jewellery are turning up in further female graves.
Now James has got a bead here, a very, very fine little amber bead.
Sources of amber are rare in Britain, but they're finding a surprising amount of this material here.
We've nearly finished excavating this burial here, and it has a young lady in it, and on her forearm is the skeleton of a baby. Placed upon both the mother and the baby were a large quantity of beads. So far we've got nearly 500 of them. It's really quite extraordinary.
Many of these female skeletons are buried with elaborate bead necklaces.
That's quite some bling.
It's been a successful excavation, and with so many intriguing discoveries, what can the archaeologists tell us about these people and their bling? I've asked Hugh Wilmot into the lab to give me some answers.
Hugh, this is an astonishing site, and it is completely new. Nobody knew it was there.
No, absolutely. There hasn't been a cemetery in this location recorded before. At first we thought it's just going to be a standard sort of Saxon cemetery, but actually it's turned out to be rather more interesting.
And just extraordinary finds.
Amazing.
You've brought some of them in here together with one of the skeletons. Are these finds that were actually found associated with this skeleton?
Yes, these are some, not all the finds that were found with this skeleton, but here are some of the sort of the more diagnostic ones and some of the large ones.
They seem to be very richly furnished graves.
They're extremely richly furnished. Of the 24 graves we excavated, only one had no artefacts in, which is a very unusual proportion.
So she would have been placed in the grave fully clothed then with all her...
Oh yes, absolutely.
With all her accessories. What's that? It looks like a little buckle.
Well, these are where the finds start getting a bit more special.
Yeah.
It's a very unusual design that you don't normally find in Lincolnshire.
Where do you normally find it then?
Well, not many buckles like this have been found, but where they have been, they've been found in Kent or on the south coast of England.
Oh, really? So, yeah, quite some way away.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Is that one of the amber beads?
It is. It's a small bead. They're quite simple, quite plain, but this is just one example of them, of which we had hundreds.
I mean, there seem to be extraordinary numbers in each grave, or at least some of the graves were just full of these beads.
Absolutely. It's clearly one of their sort of biggest fashion statements, these necklaces, and certainly the most visible thing.
And do we know where this amber has come from? Because obviously that's not local.
We do. 20 years ago, all these techniques for provenancing the amber, looking at the sort of ivory, you know, we couldn't do that, so you had to speculate. But now we can actually put some hard answers to some of these questions. And this comes from the Baltic, which is perhaps not unsurprising, because we know that the Baltic is a major supplier of amber.
And now, what about that ivory? Is that likely to have come along a similar reach, then, from Northern Europe into Northern Asia?
Well, that's an interesting question, because in the past, people have speculated that perhaps, because you've got an amber trade coming from the Baltic, that perhaps ivory was coming in the form of mammoth ivory from Siberia, where it's sort of preserved in the permafrost, and perhaps the same trade routes are bringing that ivory. But we've done radiocarbon dating on this ivory, and it's clearly contemporary to the Anglo-Saxon cemetery, so it must be an elephant.
Yeah, because mammoths weren't there at this time.
They've been extinct for 10,000 years. So, you know, this has come from either Africa or maybe even India.
And what about the individuals themselves? Because you can provenance the amber and the ivory. There's a chance of provenancing these individuals. So do you have any results from that yet?
We do, and that's what's so exciting. Previously, we've kind of speculated where these people may have come from, whether they're perhaps, you know, locals who have adopted new fashions, or have they actually migrated from, you know, northern Germany, from Denmark. And we've done isotope analysis on this individual, and we came up with quite a surprising result. They're not from Lincolnshire, but they're not from further afield in terms of across the North Sea. This individual grew up on the south coast, Kent, perhaps around as far as Brighton, that kind of a region.
Really?
Yeah. So
and isn't it extraordinary to have that level of biography of somebody?
Absolutely.
That you know that as a young girl she was living down in the southeast, and then she moved northwards and ended up in Lincolnshire.
Yeah.
For me, this is where she came from. She's wearing things still, which hark back to her childhood in Kent.
Absolutely, absolutely. So there's a memory that lingers.
Yeah.
This new discovery at Scremby is revealing some wonderful detail of life in the Dark Ages, and it's allowing us to delve deeper into the cultural connections of our Anglo-Saxon ancestors across the British Isles and beyond. Our next dig diary takes us to the furthest reaches of northern Scotland and the remote island of Rousey in Orkney. The islands of Orkney are home to an abundance of well-preserved archaeology, and Rousey is no exception, having been nicknamed the Egypt of the North. But its sites are often troubled by more than their fair share of bad weather, with aggressive tides causing erosion along the coastline. But sometimes with destruction comes discovery. In 2010, winter storms revealed a line of stones on a beach, and archaeologists realised that they could be looking at the first signs of an ancient monument dating right back to Britain's earliest civilization. perhaps even a new jewel in Orkney's crown. This summer, the team is back on site for their 8th season, and they're led by Steve Dockrell and Julie Bond from the University of Bradford. Orkney is peppered with incredible prehistoric sites, and the team already believe that they've found something very special here on Rousey, a Neolithic tomb dating back more than 4,000 years. Photos taken just a few years ago show the circular walls of the monument.
The way they built these tombs was to build up concentric walls of stone. So you end up with a kind of a big mound, and over the years you end up with something like a green hill.
But these rings have now been reduced to rubble. Much of the monument has already been destroyed by the sea.
It's heartbreaking that we're watching this thing disappear, but it gives us an opportunity to excavate and to pick this apart and to really understand how these were built.
This golden opportunity should provide invaluable clues into the monument's construction and use over time, before it is lost to the waves forever.
Well, this is the second day of uncovering the chambered tomb. We're a little bit worried as to how much is still left. Although this passage is still here, it looks from the angle as if some of the lower parts might have disappeared.
Once they've removed the protecting stones laid over the site, the team are down to the well-built walls of the tomb.
The wall goes off down onto the beach, curves around in a huge arc and comes back again. This seems to be the doorway.
And as they dig through into the passageway, the archaeologists uncover some tantalising clues as to the tomb's internal construction.
My lord! Wow, look at that! That's huge! As they've gone back into this area here, enormous great stones have appeared, and they are absolutely massive. We're talking about something before they broke that would be about this wide. So that's got to be roof of something, a lintel from something, which is really interesting.
These huge slabs would have spanned the width of the passageway, and they remind us that our Neolithic ancestors were skilled engineers. The team wants to locate the central area of the tomb, so this year they've been given an opportunity to move further landward. But it's already thrown them a monumental curveball. As the team excavate down through the mound's central top layers, they come across evidence that just doesn't add up. Someone seems to have made this tomb into a home.
Well, this is the surprise this year. This is the thing we didn't quite expect. It looks like we've got an Iron Age house right in the top of the tomb. You can see there's a series of upright stones going round in an arc, and then there's another wall, quite a big wall, coming round this way as well.
This new evidence suggests that the Neolithic tomb, which housed the dead over 4,000 years ago, then became a home to the living 2,000 years later. The new circular feature indicates that this is an Iron Age roundhouse constructed deep into the central parts of the monument. The insertion of this younger building into the original structure is a revelation for the archaeologists, who now believe that this wasn't the only new build in the area. In another trench, just yards from the tomb's entranceway, the tomb have uncovered yet another stone-built structure, and it has a surprising array of features.
Look at it. Yes!
This is architecturally very characteristic of a Pictish building which is roughly 500 to 900 AD. We've got a staircase that leads down and into the building. We've got a central hearth, but crucially around it as well, we've got really black layers filled with charcoal and other material, and 2 anvil stones set next to the hearth.
Remarkably, what the archaeologists have discovered is a Scottish Iron Age or Pictish blacksmith's workshop over 1,000 years old. And as they dig the final layers, they uncover evidence of early and extremely rare industrial activity, including copper working.
We would expect all settlement sites to have evidence of blacksmithing, but to find a building that is a dedicated coppersmith's workshop is exceptional. We would normally only expect to find such a site in very, very high status sites and in larger urban settlements.
As the team records the final sections of the smithy, they get one more surprise. There are greasy finger stains on one of the anvil stones, an incredible link straight back to the blacksmith who worked in this building over 1,000 years ago. I've asked Julie Bond and Steve Dockrell into the lab to tell me more about this extraordinary place.
This is such an incredibly complicated site.
We have dug sites in the Northern Isles before, so we knew they were complex, but this is an order above, I think.
What is amazing about this site is that it was a real hotbed of activity.
I think it must have been a very busy place, and the archaeology there is quite remarkable. We get settlement build up for these long periods of time.
And what about the reuse of this Neolithic tomb? It seems very odd that Iron Age people should come along and just want to build their houses into the side of it.
It may be because it's a ready source of dressed stone. It may also be something to do with identity and ownership of that part of the landscape.
Maybe they have an interest in what's gone before.
That it's not just about using the stone,
No.
that they're close to the ancestors, perhaps?
Close to the ancestors.
And then you've got evidence of metalwork.
This is probably part of the tuyere, which is basically usually a piece of stone or a block of clay that you put the bellows through. It's to protect the bellows from catching fire.
Right.
So that you can pump air into your hearth to get the temperature up high.
Yeah.
So we actually know where the smith was sitting and where the person working the bellows was sitting in that little building.
Yeah, yeah.
See how they've lived their lives in those places, which
And
is...
see where people have kneeled.
Yes.
I mean,
That's right.
I was amazed by that.
Yes,
that must be a
it's
very
absolutely
rare
fantastic,
find
isn't it?
indeed.
I mean, you can see those fingerprints there, and you can see these carbon splodges where we think the smith would have been kneeling up against it.
Yeah.
This is a beech cobble that's been used as a hammerstone, and they're incredibly strong. So they make ideal anvils.
Yeah.
And we only found these finger marks when we cleaned it. It was totally invisible when we were excavating it.
How have they survived?
It would have been dark, the metal would have been glowing, it would have been hot, smoky, lots of carbon, lots of sweat.
So kind of grease and soot together, staining the stone.
I don't think I've ever had quite such a vivid understanding of how somebody used a building.
We can actually piece together exactly how people operated. So that's quite an unusual thing for archaeology, to be able to place people into it.
The sort of place that people coming to Orkney would have heard about, would have known about.
Would have known about.
It was a highway. It was a gateway to the Atlantic going out.
Go that way and that's all you have in front of you, is the Atlantic. Turn left and you're heading towards the rest of Scotland and down through the islands towards Ireland. Turn right.
You're heading to Scandinavia.
Yeah.
And of course that was so important in the Viking period.
This gateway works both ways because the Vikings we know were certainly settled nearby, possibly on this site, because first generation Vikings were buried close to this site. And so it's a bit of a temptation, isn't it, if you're sailing past this wonderful site with the, with its own coppersmith and all these indications of wealth, and you're a Viking in a longship. Are you going to leave that alone?
These new discoveries on Rousey show that, far from being a remote group of islands, Orkney was a vibrant and busy hub which was occupied by wave after wave of people for thousands of years through prehistory. At the National Museum of Scotland, they have further evidence of this activity.
The collection centre houses some 12 million objects, and amongst them is an artefact that speaks of the enduring importance of Orkney, sitting right at the centre of a maritime network that continues into the Viking period.
The Westness brooch was found in 1963 in a Viking burial not far from the Neolithic tomb on Rousey. I've met with early medieval expert Dr. Adrian Maldonado, who's going to tell me more about this exquisite object. So Adrian, these objects all come from the same grave, and usually I'd be fascinated in these beautiful brooches, but they're slightly eclipsed by this amazing object.
Not only is this the best example of a brooch pin of its kind, the entire grave is the richest female Viking burial in Scotland. The technology of filigree, that sort of dotting of gold into beaded wire, that's something that we're getting from Anglo-Saxon metalwork at this time that is then adopted into Irish and Scottish metalworking. Here you can see the head of a kind of beaked creature, and then you have this amazing sort of wolf head, a sort of ferocious creature.
Yeah. Do we know anything else about her? Do we know where she came from? I mean, did she live in Orkney, or was she from elsewhere?
Now, this is an interesting thing. One of the things that they've been able to do is test the teeth of the females in the Westness cemetery to see whether they were local or not. And what's come out of this is that they're not from Orkney, but they're from somewhere in the British Isles, either from Eastern Britain, Lowland Britain, or Lowland Ireland.
So they're not local then?
People from outside Orkney are settling in Orkney at that time.
Yeah.
They're creating new settlements and sometimes sort of continuing older ones.
So Orkney was a great place to be. It was right at the centre of this Viking world.
Absolutely. If you're involved in long-distance sea trade, Orkney's where you want to be.
Discoveries like this from the Viking Age shows how archaeology can change the story of Britain and revise our understanding of life in the past. Our final dig takes us to the city of Salford, where archaeologists are delving into the heartland of Britain's Industrial Revolution to uncover the largest jail in Georgian England. The site of New Bailey Prison sits on the edge of the River Irwell, in an area linked to the heavy industrialisation of Salford, which began over 200 years ago. As Salford's industry boomed, its population expanded and crime increased. At its zenith, New Bailey Prison was the largest in the country, and it could hold 750 prisoners. Now, an excavation provides an unprecedented opportunity to find out what the lives of those prisoners were like during the Industrial Revolution. As part of a major regeneration of Salford, archaeologists are getting a chance to scrape back the centuries and reveal evidence of a radical new approach to crime and punishment. On site are a team from the University of Salford, headed by Rachel Reeder and Mike Novell. They are currently in their 5th and final year, and Digging for Britain has been following them all the way. The dig is focusing on the later 1820s extension of the prison, and preservation is looking good.
What we are seeing is how these buildings were actually built. The foundations are surviving 2, even 3 metres deep in places, which is brilliant.
And better yet is that these new discoveries aren't even documented on the plans.
All of this is below ground, so we certainly had no idea that this was here. We're finding those little bit of extras that kind of help tell the story about this site.
Further exploration of the foundations has uncovered hints that the prisoners may have been allowed some surprising creature comforts.
Oh, blimey. There it is. So we found what looks like the remnants of a heating system, which is very unusual, completely unexpected, not on the maps.
And Andy thinks he's discovered where the main boiler was positioned.
You have a staircase. So the stairs came down here. There's your access to your boiler house. This is probably part of the fire pit underneath the actual boiler itself. The heat would have gone up. There would have been flues going into the other cells.
And there's coke. It's a great indication what they're actually doing in there. Just further evidence that we've definitely got a heating system here.
And heating isn't what you'd expect to find in a prison of this age.
We know the really poorest working classes
actually were being better fed and better looked after in this prison than they would be out in the industrialised slums in the 1840s.
But despite being heated, some of the cells became increasingly cramped.
This is probably no more than 2 by 2 metres. More than one person would have had to have slept in here, possibly up to 3 people at one point.
As the local population expanded and crime increased, the number of prisoners eventually became overwhelming.
Ultimately, the prison has far more people in it than it was originally designed for. This was recognised in the 1860s as being unworkable.
Hemmed in by urban developments, the prison couldn't expand, and it finally closed in 1868, making way for the larger prisons of an even more brutal Victorian age. I've asked Rachel Reeder and Mike Neville into the lab to discuss their discoveries and find out more about prison life at New Bailey during the Industrial Revolution. This is an incredible opportunity to excavate a prison which starts in the Georgian period and goes all the way through into the Victorian period.
The prison was built at a time of improvement and enlightenment. This is a new type of prison building. It's one of the first of its type in the UK.
And you discovered quite a lot that isn't on the plans. What was the most surprising thing about it to you?
I think the discovery of a heating system in the cells, which was completely unexpected, not on the plans.
And that's part of the flue, is it?
It absolutely is, yeah. So there were several of these kind of built up into a wall, and it would have basically directed the hot air from this boiler to the cells. How effective it was, we don't actually know, but we've got it, which was fantastic.
And in terms of what life was like for the prisoners, it can't have all been a bed of roses, surely, living in a prison like that.
It's not designed to be a bed of roses.
No, absolutely not. I mean, we know from the records that some of those that were sentenced to hard labour had to work on the treadmill, and we know that they were climbing around 20,000 feet a day. That's 2/3 the height of Everest. And now initially it was actually connected to a mill that kind of ground up wood for dye, which was kind of then passed out and sold to the local mills. But then it was disconnected eventually, so we know that they were climbing on that for absolutely no purpose whatsoever.
And what about the population in the prison? Who would have been there? What kind of cross-section of society?
We would have had men, women, we would have even had children in here. I think the records show that the youngest children we would have had would have been about 9, 10 years old.
Well, you have to remember that these are minor offenders. They're not mass murderers, they're not people who've committed a serious crime. It's petty theft, it's brawling in the streets, it's vagrancy. Now that means they're from the poorest part of the working population of Salford and Manchester. And we do have some comments from women bursting into tears when they are about to be released from the prison because they're faced with going back to those kind of slum conditions.
Yeah, and your excavations have shown that at least they were in a place which was, heated during the winter. This fascinating excavation has allowed us to go beyond the written record, uncovering a revolutionary and more human approach to the criminal system in the 18th century that's often hidden from view. From uncovering a lost World War II plane and the tragic story of its brave pilot, to glimpsing an incredibly well-preserved Iron Age village occupied over 2,500 years ago, we've been able to reach back through the centuries and touch the lives of our ancestors.